They'll sell me at dawn, the Comanche girl whispered, her voice breaking against the cold canvas walls. But I can cook so clean. I'll be anything you need. That night in the frozen Colorado territory of 1874, survival hinged on desperate bargains and fragile hope. One girl's plea would collide with the silence of a grieving man and change both their lives forever. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you are watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. The wind screamed across the ridge like a wounded animal, tearing through canvas tents, rattling tin pots and dragging coal smoke low over the frozen earth. March in the Colorado Territory was a cruel season. Spring never came when you needed it most. The Stratton Ridge mining camp sprawled like a scar on the land, a scatter of sagging tents, barrels burning with weak fire, and men whose faces had forgotten laughter. And into this scar, under cover of night, they brought her. Her name was Naya, 19 years old, daughter of wild prairie winds. She had no chains on her wrists, but she didn't need them. The way the guards looked at her, casual, certain cold, was worse than iron. Chains you could break. A gaze like that told you were already sold. They shoved her into an empty tent at the far edge of camp. Inside a cot, a cracked basin with water the color of ash, and a blanket that smelled of mildew. She did not sit. She did not sleep. She stood in the cold arms wrapped around herself, staring at the canvas walls that flapped like dying lungs. Outside, drunken voices passed by. "She's marked for dawn," one man muttered. "Foreman says first pick," another answered, his words slurred. "Don't matter. She won't last long here anyway." Naya pressed her lips tight, fighting the tremor in her breath. She moved quietly to the tent flap, lifted it just enough to see. A guard held a clipboard with a crude list of names. She saw her own at the top. Next to it, kitchen personal selection. Her heart hammered. She knew what those words meant. Morning was her deadline. The fires outside sank into embers, men stumbled into tents, and the camp settled into the stillness of half-sleep. That was when she moved. Barefoot careful, she slipped into the shadows, her thin dress clinging to her legs in the bitter wind. She darted between wagons and stacked crates, breath clouding in front of her. Every step was a prayer to no one in particular, just to survive until dawn without being taken. She knew where she was going, toward the far side of camp where a tent stood taller than the rest. Reinforced with wood slats flanked by crates of surveying tools, its lamplight burned steady. Rumors whispered of the man inside. Not cruel, not drunk, not like the others. His name was Ethan Beckett, 34, a mining engineer who still wore his wedding ring, though his wife had been gone for years. Some said he was strange, a man who barely spoke, who drank less than the rest, who scribbled on maps long into the night. Naya crouched outside his tent, trembling. What if he turned her away? What if he called the guards? But what choice did she have? She pushed open the flap. Inside, the air was warmer. A single lantern glowed over a drafting table buried in maps and tools. Ethan sat with his back to her gray flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves, his fingers blackened with soot and oil. His shoulders were broad but hunched like the weight of years pressed down on him. Naya stepped inside, her voice small but cutting through the silence. "Sir." He turned startled, his brow furrowing when he saw her. She dropped to her knees. "They'll sell me at dawn," she whispered, words tumbling like broken glass. "But I can cook, sew, clean. I will be anything you need, please." The lantern light flickered across his face as he stood slowly. He looked at her not with hunger, not with disgust, but confusion, as if he wasn't sure she was real. "You don't have to touch me," she rushed on. "I will stay out of your way. I cannot go to them. Please." The silence stretched thick as smoke. Finally, Ethan crouched down until his eyes met hers. His voice was quiet, rough from disuse. "What is your name, Naya?" she breathed. He studied her, his gaze steady, unreadable. Then he rose, walked to his desk, and pulled open a drawer. From it, he drew a pad of forms, requisition slips, used to assign camp labor. With deliberate strokes, he wrote, "Name, Naya, assignment. Personal, camp assistant, engineering division, signature E. Beckett." Then he took the brass camp seal from his belt and pressed it into the paper with a thud. He turned back and held it out to her. "Stay here tonight," he said simply. "No one will touch you." Naya's hands trembled as she took the slip. She clutched it as if it were a shield. though she knew paper could burn, could tear. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan didn't reply. He returned to his maps, his pen scratching across paper, but his shoulders softened, some hidden tension uncoiling. For the first time in years, his hand slowed on the page, as if the ink carried a different weight now. Naya curled into the corner of the tent, clutching the stamped slip like a lifeline. The blanket scratched her skin, but she wrapped it tightly anyway. She did not close her eyes. She listened to the steady sound of his pen, the lantern's hiss, the occasional sigh he gave without realizing. Dawn was still hours away, but for the first time since being dragged into camp, she allowed herself to believe she might see it. When morning finally broke, the camp roared awake, boots on gravel, shouts for coffee, the metallic clang of tools. Men lined up hungover but sharp-eyed. Ethan walked into the administrative shack, the slip in his hand. The foreman, a grizzled man with a scowl carved into his face, squinted at the paper. "Personal assistant," he sneered. "Since when does a damn engineer need one?" Ethan's voice was calm, flat. "Since the survey reports are 3 weeks behind and my tent looks like a landslide. Unless you'd rather help me catalog equipment yourself." The foreman grunted. "You vouch for her, I do." A long pause. Then the stamp came down with a heavy thud. By afternoon, whispers spread through camp. The Comanche girl had been placed in the engineer's private quarters. Every glance that followed her was sharp, some curious, some envious, some cruel. Naya moved quietly, clutching the blanket over her shoulders as she stepped inside Ethan's tent. The canvas walls flapped in the wind, but inside it was different now. A space waiting to be lived in if she dared. She looked at the cot, at the bottle of whiskey on the floor, at the dust thick as ash on every surface. She did not ask permission. She rolled up her sleeves, took the basin of murky water, and began to clean. The cot creaked as she stripped it bare. Dust rose in clouds as she swept the floor. She scrubbed soot from the stove until her knuckles bled. By evening, her hands were cracked, blackened, raw. But the tent looked human again, warm, almost breathing. When Ethan returned, he stopped in the entrance, staring. The bottle was gone. The cot made. The floor swept. He said nothing. Walked past her, sat down. Naya stirred the pot over the stove, spooning out stew she'd made from salted meat and roots she'd traded for. She placed the bowl on the table in front of him. Ethan ate slowly, silently, until the bowl was clean. She stood by the stove, watching him, her heart still pounding. Outside, the camp burned with whispers. Inside, in the glow of a single lantern, something unspoken began to take root. The morning after her first night in Ethan's tent, the mining camp stirred with its usual brutality. Metal clanging against rock boots, crunching over gravel. Men shouting at one another with a sharpness that came not from duty, but from anger, from exhaustion, from lives lived too long in dust and smoke. Yet something had shifted in a small corner of the camp. Naya rose before the sun, her body stiff, her hands blistered from scrubbing soot until her skin split. She stoked the stove with trembling fingers, boiled water in a dented pot, and folded Ethan's scattered maps where the wind had torn them across his desk. She moved with quiet purpose, the way someone moved when they knew they were tolerated only so long as they were useful. Ethan emerged from behind the curtain partition he'd rigged with a woolen blanket, his face shadowed by stubble and weariness. He paused when he saw her already bent over the stove. For a moment, he looked almost startled, as if he had forgotten what it was like to wake to the sound of another person's breathing, the smell of coffee, the presence of order in his tent. "You're awake early," he muttered, his voice still heavy with sleep. Naya didn't turn. "The others rise at dawn. I thought it best to be ready." He said nothing more, only took the chipped mug she placed on the table. The steam curled into the air, carrying with it the faint bitterness of boiled grounds. Outside, the foreman's bark carried across the camp a constant reminder that here nothing belonged to anyone but the company. Yet when Ethan stepped out, he carried the stamped slip of paper that bore her name, and that slip, thin, fragile, was enough to draw a line between her and the men who would have claimed her. The foreman's eyes narrowed when he saw her pass behind Ethan, clutching a basin of water. "So it's true," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. The engineer took himself a little helper. Ethan's gaze was sharp as flint. "You have a problem with my efficiency." The foreman spat into the dirt. "I have a problem with favoritism." "You want the reports done on time?" Ethan asked flatly. Then you'll let me do it my way. The foreman grunted, but his silence was a concession. He turned away, barking orders at a cluster of miners dragging carts. Ethan did not look back at him. He simply walked toward the shafts, his shoulders squared, leaving Naya to bear the weight of every burning glance the men threw her way. That afternoon she worked without pause. She swept laundered patched shirts with small, precise stitches. When she came across a pile of cracked copper wire and broken lamps stacked in the corner, she sorted them quietly, arranging pieces by size, cleaning the soot with her bare hands. Her fingers bled, but she did not stop. By evening, Ethan returned to find the tent transformed again. Crates lined neatly along one wall, tools arranged by purpose, the stove polished to a dull shine. The cot was made with the care of someone who had been denied the right to sleep in one. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes flicking from the cleared floor to the folded laundry. A silence stretched between them, thick with things unsaid. Naya stirred a pot on the stove, her back to him. The scent of stew filled the tent, salted meat, boiled with wild roots she had bartered from a camp cook. She ladled it into a bowl and set it on the table without a word. Ethan ate slowly, his eyes fixed not on her, but on the bowl. Only when it was empty did he glance toward the shelf near his cot. There, tucked beneath a handkerchief she had found while cleaning, rested a small tin box. Naya hesitated, then lifted it gently. She opened it, revealing an old photograph, its edges curled and faded. A young woman stood in a summer dress printed with tiny sunflowers, her hand resting on Ethan's arm. Her smile was soft, full of a life that no longer lived in this place. Naya's breath caught. She looked at him, then closed the tin with care. "I did not mean to intrude," she whispered. For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the photograph, though it was already hidden away again. Finally, his voice came low, almost hoarse. "She made stew like this. Years ago." "I guess," Naya said softly. The silence that followed was different. Not the silence of strangers, not the silence of suspicion. It was the silence of two people standing on the edge of something fragile, neither willing to break it, neither able to step away. That night, Ethan set aside his papers earlier than usual. He drank less, the untouched bottle of whiskey sitting by the wall. The lamp glowed lower, casting a gentler light over the canvas walls. And when Naya lay down behind the curtain staring at the ceiling of rough canvas, she listened to the stillness of the man on the other side. He had not thanked her, but he had eaten every bite of her stew. Days passed in rhythm strange and unspoken. Naya rose at dawn, stoked the stove, and laid out Ethan's maps when the wind scattered them. She scrubbed pans until her knuckles cracked. She stitched his shirt when a seam split her hands, working with the memory of a mother who once sewed by firelight before she was taken. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned how to disappear into usefulness, how to avoid drawing the wrong kind of notice. Ethan said little. He offered no thanks, no questions. Only the occasional nod when she handed him his coffee, only silence when she cleared his table. But something shifted. He began to drink less. He lit the lamp earlier, not working himself into exhaustion. Sometimes after supper he sat outside the tent, not speaking but simply listening. The wind moving through the ridges, the small sounds of another person's presence beside him. For the first time in years, his silence felt less like distance and more like thaw. One morning, as Naya sorted cloth from an old supply crate, she found a strip of canvas too frayed to be mended. Its edges were torn, its center stained. Instead of discarding it, she took a piece of charcoal from the stove bin. Her fingers, stiff from cold, moved with uncertain but deliberate strokes. The lines were rough, uneven. But in the center of the scrap, a sunflower bloomed round stubborn, a burst of gold sketched against gray. When Ethan returned from the shafts that evening, he paused by his cot. His eyes lingered on the flower tacked to the wall longer than he realized. He said nothing. He did not remove it. The next day passed without mention of it. But that night, as Naya stirred stew over the stove, Ethan spoke for the first time in days. "Why a sunflower?" She blinked, surprised. Then she shrugged slightly. "They follow the sun, even when the sky is full of smoke." Ethan sat down across from her, his gaze fixed on the flames. "My wife, her family grew them. In Missouri. Acres of them. She wore them in her hair." Naya passed him his bowl in silence. After a long pause, his voice dropped lower. She died 3 years ago. There was a raid. The militia said it was Comanche. I never saw who fired the first shot. The cabin burned. I found her in the ash. The stew spoon trembled in Naya's hand. Her throat tightened. My mother was sold, she said softly, by a man who promised to marry her. He traded her to a passing caravan. I was 5. She told me to hide under a pile of skins. I never saw her again. Her voice did not break. She did not cry. She only stared at the fire as if it were the only thing that had never abandoned her. The tent was silent. The wind brushed against the flaps, carrying with it the sound of a sunflower cloth trembling like it too was listening. When Ethan finished his stew, he stood his shadow long across the canvas wall. He paused by the curtain that separated their sleeping spaces. The canvas is yours, he said quietly. You do not need permission to hang what you draw. And then he stepped behind the curtain, leaving her staring at the crude sunflower she had pinned to the wall, its petals jagged but unbowed. For the first time in her life, Naya felt she had planted something and that it had taken root. The mess tent smelled of grease and smoke, a heavy stench that clung to every surface like a second skin. Naya worked quietly in the corner, scrubbing a cast-iron pot until her raw knuckles stung with heat. Around her, the clamor rose boots dragging across splintered floorboards, the scrape of tin cups, laughter thick with liquor. Most of the men had been drinking since sundown. They'd struck silver in shaft 3 that week, and their joy had the sharp edge of something dangerous. It was laughter that wasn't born of happiness, but of men desperate to forget they were alive, only to dig, to scrape, to break. Naya kept her head low, her braid falling forward to shield her face. Her fingers burned from the pot's scalding water, yet she scrubbed harder, willing herself invisible. But invisibility was never hers to control. She felt him before she heard him. A miner loomed into her space, broad-shouldered, his shirt damp with sweat, his breath thick with liquor. His eyes glowed red with the kind of hunger that saw only possession. Well, well, he drawled, leaning too close. The Comanche flower they gave to the engineer. Must be nice, huh? Sleeping your way into a warm cot. The words struck like slaps. Naya's throat tightened, but she said nothing. He reached his hand like a shackle around her wrist. The pot nearly slipped from her grasp. I asked you a question, he snarled, twisting her arm until she winced. The room quieted. Boots stopped scuffing. Cups hovered midair. A few men chuckled, some shifted uneasily, but none stepped forward. The miner's grip hardened, his sneer widening. You think you're better than us, hiding behind Beckett, behind your pretty boy protector? Naya's voice was steady, though her arm throbbed. I am not yours. The silence deepened, heavy watching. He shoved her backward against a table. Pots clattered to the ground, water splashing her back, slamming against rough wood. She gasped, breath-stolen pain shooting down her side. He pressed closer, his face inches from hers, sour breath filling her lungs. And then the iron shovel struck with the sound of thunder. The miner howled, his body collapsing to the floor. He tried to rise, but another blow came swift and merciless, cracking across his elbow. The sickening snap echoed louder than any laugh. Chaos erupted. Shouts filled the room. Men surged to their feet, some yelling, some scrambling toward the foreman. Ethan stood over the crumpled body chest, heaving the shovel gripped in his hands. His eyes were dark, unblinking. He looked less like an engineer and more like something the mine itself had carved from stone and fire. Naya stood frozen, her hair plastered to her face with sweat, her breath ragged. The miner writhed on the floor, screaming, his arm bent at an angle that promised no easy healing. The 4 men arrived minutes later, flanked by 2 company men and the mine sheriff. They pulled Ethan into the administrative shack, circling him like wolves. Ethan stood rigid, his arms folded across his chest, his gaze straight ahead. He was drunk, he said flatly. He grabbed her. I responded. You broke his damn arm, the sheriff snapped. He'll still be able to dig. Ethan replied. Eventually. Don't get clever with me, Beckett, the sheriff growled. This isn't a city court. You're not some union officer anymore. You don't get to play hero here. Ethan said nothing. His silence was sharper than words. One of the supervisors leaned forward, his tone cold. You're valuable, Beckett, but no one is irreplaceable, especially not over some camp girl. Ethan met his eyes without flinching. Then fire me. A long pause. The sheriff cursed under his breath. Hell with it. You're on warning. One more incident like this, you're gone. No severance, no escort. Ethan nodded once. No apology, no fear. Back in the tent, Naya sat on the cot, her lips split, a bruise already darkening along her jaw. Her hands trembled as she clutched the blanket. When Ethan stepped inside, she rose quickly. You should not have done that, she whispered, her voice breaking. They will hate you now. They already did, Ethan answered simply. He peeled off his gloves, placed them neatly on the table, and knelt at the stove, coaxing the fire back to life. Naya turned away, blinking back the sting in her eyes. No one ever did that before, she murmured. No one ever chose me. Not like that. Ethan didn't answer. He only nodded, feeding wood into the flame. Later, after she had fallen asleep, he noticed the sunflower cloth she'd pinned beside his cot. During the scuffle, it had been ripped from the wall, stepped on its center, torn jaggedly in two. He picked it up, brushing away dirt with careful fingers. Sitting at the desk beneath the lamplight, he threaded a needle and began to stitch. His hands were strong, clumsy, with fabric, but deliberate. It took him over an hour, each pass of the thread slow, methodical, as though he were mending not just cloth, but something deeper. When he was done, he rose, crossed the tent, and rehung the sunflower exactly where it had been. The seam was visible now, a scar cutting through the petals. But the flower still stood crooked, worn, defiant. The wind howled down from the ridge that night, shaking the tent. Inside, the sunflower cloth trembled on the wall, stitched back together by a man who hadn't mended anything in years. Naya, asleep behind the curtain, shifted in her dreams. For the first time since she had been dragged into this camp, the fire in the stove burned warm. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan Beckett sat by the lamplight, staring at that crooked flower, and let his shoulders rest. Dawn crept in pale and hollow, a thin spill of light across canvas and thread. Naya woke to the hush of coals in the stove and the slow ache in her hands. For a moment she could not place what was different, why the tent felt steadier, warmer, as if some invisible draft had been mended in the night. Then she saw it. The sunflower cloth hung back in its place beside Ethan's cot. Its torn center had been stitched with patient, clumsy care, a visible seam running through the heart of the flower like a healed wound. She sat up slowly, fingers touching the new line of thread. Someone had chosen not to throw it away. Someone had decided broken could stay. Ethan emerged from behind the wool curtain with the guarded stillness of a man who expected every morning to take something from him. He paused when he noticed her studying the cloth. For a breath, the two of them stood inside a silence that felt less like absence and more like the inside of a bell, just after it's been struck. I boiled the coffee, she said, voice small. He nodded, took the mug. Good. It was not thanks. But the word landed near it. Outside the camp coughed itself awake, metal against metal, curses tossed like stones. The low bark of the foreman counting heads. Wind dragged coal smoke low over the ground and smeared the morning into a gray that made the eyes sting. The men saw Ethan step out with his assistant at his shoulder, and their looks cut sharper than the air. The story of the shovel had already jumped tents like sparks in dry grass. Someone had drawn a crude picture in the dirt by their guy line, a sunflower with its head lopped off. Someone else had spilled a bucket of slop just where their flap would open. A nail had been hammered up through the threshold board so a careless foot would find it. Naya said nothing. She fetched a rag and cleared the mess without letting her mouth tremble. When she pried the nail free, she wrapped it in cloth, tied a careful knot, and set it on a crate as if returning a dangerous thought to sleep. Ethan watched the whole time, the muscle in his jaw working, until finally he reached into a canvas roll and pressed something into her palm. Work gloves small enough to fit her hands, the leather oiled, the stitching new. You'll need these, he said. The gift was plain as a lantern. She slid them on. The leather felt like permission. Work sought them both. Ethan shouldered his tools and headed toward the shaft mouths where the air tasted of pennies. Naya scrubbed and stitched folded shirts, cataloged wire by gauge, polished the little iron stove until it held a dim reflection of the tent's glow. She set a pot to simmer bone broth punched with onion and wild sage she'd traded for from a cook, who had watched her with eyes that said, "Women recognize the same storms even in different skies." By noon, the camp thrummed with its usual fever. The foreman's voice cracked like a whip outside the administrative shack. Inside, Ethan stood over a map pinned with nails, a red grease line chasing a vein that dropped into darker strata. The mine sheriff leaned against a post hat, tilted low, watching with a knot smile. "We push deeper here," the foreman said, tapping the red line. "Blast through the choke, clear the pocket." Ethan's eyes tracked the contours of rock like a man reading a warning written by God. "The gauges are off. We've got wet spots turning sour. You'll load a charge in there. You'll wake everything that wants to burn." "Everything down there wants to burn," the sheriff drawled. "That's why we're here." "Ventilate," Ethan said. "Give it a week." "We don't have a week." The foreman's finger jabbed the map. "You're paid to say how not to say no." Ethan's gaze moved from the map to the men. "You want me to put my name under a blast I know is bad, or we find another man whose name weighs less?" The air in the room thinned. Ethan's face didn't change, but something in the set of his shoulders hardened stone, deciding it would rather crack than bend. "I'll rerun the survey," he said, neutral as a blade. "If the numbers change, I'll sign." Today, the foreman snapped. Today, Ethan agreed. When he left the shack, the wind caught his coat and tried to carry him backward. He let it. For one heartbeat, he allowed himself to lean into the push as if to say, "I hear you." Then he walked back to the tent with the kind of straight line that made other men step aside without knowing why. Naya was setting 2 bowls when he ducked in. He unrolled his sleeves. Blood had dried along his knuckles in thin half-moons where the shovel handle had bitten him the night before. She lifted his hand without asking and turned it in the lantern light. "I have salve," she murmured. "Comfrey and bear fat. Old women taught my mother. My mother taught me." She hesitated, then added, "Before." He let his hand rest in hers while she cleaned the cuts with warmed water and a scrap of linen. He flinched once and pretended he hadn't. She pretended not to see. "The sheriff says you're on warning," she said after a while, eyes on the small work of binding what was torn. Ethan looked at the stitched sunflower. "So are you," he said, "by men who never learned to warn with words. Silence, the kind that let 2 people hear the same thing without it being said, 'This will cost us.'" They ate, each tasting the care the other had put into something as simple as meat softening in heat. When they finished, Naya pulled a shirt from the stack, a favorite of his, by the look of it frayed at the cuff, a little tear by the shoulder seam where a tool had caught it. She threaded a needle. He turned to his notebook's pencil, scratching slow and spare. The tent took on that evening stillness that felt like a held breath. Outside boots slurred past with laughter too loud to mean joy. Someone sang off-key about a woman he'd never see again. A bottle broke. Nobody apologized. As the light sank, Naya stepped out to fetch water. The ridge wore a crown of red dust, low clouds, bruised with dusk, pressing their cold bellies against it. She moved carefully, scarf pulled up against the bite. Her new gloves slick with meltwater as she filled the bucket from the barrel. At the corner of the mess tent, a pair of men leaned and watched her in the way men watch a deer they are not hungry enough yet to chase. One lifted 2 fingers to his brow in a mock salute. The other let his mouth slant into something that wasn't a smile. She kept her eyes on the ground. The tarp of the far supply stack flapped like a big black tongue tasting the storm. She hurried back. Someone had shoved a folded scrap beneath their flap rope. She saw it as she lifted the canvas, a curl of dirty paper acid-browned at one edge, where a coal had kissed it. She didn't need to open it to know, but she did. "Paper won't protect you." She stared a heartbeat longer than wisdom, and then fed the note to the stove. It curled, blackened, and lifted in a brief, bright forgetfulness. The ash rose, whirled, and settled along the visible seam of the sunflower. For some reason, that felt like prophecy. Night thickened. Ethan returned late, raw coal on his cuffs. A lantern soot ringed where the flame had eaten whatever oxygen the tunnel offered to the greedy. He wiped his hands, peeled off his coat, and sat. He did not mention the note. She did not ask how he knew. "Your knuckles will pull if you don't sleep with them open," she said, and guided his hand palm up across a folded blanket so the fingers wouldn't curl closed on pain. He let her. "I'll be down in 3 tomorrow," he said. "Gauge readings are wrong. I want to see the rock breathe for myself. Rock that breathes, she repeated, half wonder, half dread. It exhales when you're not listening, he said. Tells on everyone who drilled it wrong. She pictured a chest beneath the earth rising, falling, waiting for the one fool who leaned too close. The back of her neck prickled. When I was small, she said, almost to the stove, my mother would press her ear to the prairie and tell me to listen. Bison far away, a storm, men. The ground carries warnings to the ones it wants to keep. Ethan looked at her. The lantern framed her face in a shallow bowl of gold and shadow. What did it say tonight? She swallowed. That some men only hear what they want to find. A pause, like the rest between heartbeats. I won't sign what kills us, he said. She nodded. Because belief is a thing. You hand someone before you're sure they can carry it. Later, when his breathing found the slow cadence of sleep, Naya lay awake and watched the sunflower cloth in the draft. The seam glinted where the thread caught the lantern's last trembling light. She thought of debts and of how easily a life could be mistaken for one. She thought of the miner's arm bending where arms do not bend, of laughter, leaking mean from the mess tent like oil from a cracked lamp. She thought of a child hiding under hides holding her breath, while footsteps receded, of a young woman crossing a camp to kneel in a stranger's tent and say the words you say when there is no other door. She rose bare feet silent and took up a stub of charcoal. On a second scrap she began another sunflower larger than the first, the petals messy and multitudinous and wrong in ways that made it truer. She drew not careful, but certain, the way you draw something you have never seen but have always known. When she pinned it under the first, the two flowers tilted toward each other as if conferring. Outside, a gust struck the tent and rattled every stitch. Somewhere a man cursed the weather as if the sky had done it to spite him. Somewhere a bottle rolled and struck wood. Somewhere deep in the black where lamps go to die, Rock thought dark thoughts. Naya blew out the lamp. In the sudden hush, the stove ticked itself cool. She lay down and listened for the breath of the earth, the way her mother had taught her ear, to whatever holds you hand over the place that hurts. She felt the faintest thump in the ground, and did not know if it was her heart, or the shaft, or both. Morning would come hard. The men would laugh sharp. More notes, perhaps. Another nail. He would go down where even the air did not want them. She would scrub and stitch and stew the kind of food that makes a body remember itself. That was the work as the world was. But the sunflower held, the seam held. And this too was a kind of work. Near dawn, a thin whistle slid through camp, the tuneless sound a boy sometimes made when he was trying to be braver than his age. Footfalls scuffed past their tent, quick, then quicker. A voice from far-off gauge spiked. Get Beckett! Ethan was already swinging his feet to the ground before the words fully arrived. Naya was already on her knees tying his bootlaces with the speed of someone who knows that time is a room with few doors. Her fingers fumbled once. He covered them just for a breath, just enough to say what he always tried not to say out loud. I'll come back. She swallowed. Bring the kind of air that remembers your name. He gave the smallest ghost of a smile, shouldered his kit, and was gone into the gray. Naya stood alone in the tent he'd left warm, the stove ash still faintly glowing at the seam like a coal that refused to forget heat. She turned to the sunflower cloths, a pair now, and touched the newest one where the charcoal had smudged a petal into a dark thumbprint. Stay, she told the flowers, as if they were the ones likely to run. She stoked the stove and set water on. Outside the camp gathered toward the shaft mouths like birds dragged to a storm they could not outfly. Inside, she chopped onion with steady hands and listened for the ground for breath, for the sound of rock saying yes or no. By the time the pot began to boil, the first shout came tearing over the ridge. The shout carried through the camp like a blade of lightning sharp enough to cut men mid-stride. Miners dropped their tin cups, half-chewed bread fell from mouths. The foreman's bellow rose ragged and urgent. Something had gone wrong at Shaft 3. Ethan was already there when the first crowd gathered, kneeling in the black mouth of the tunnel with a gauge clutched in his fist. The needle quivered past the red twitching like an insect trapped in glass. Vents blocked, someone shouted. Gas pocket. Ethan barked. Seal your lamps now. But the men were slow, confused by fear, and the sudden stench of something metallic and wrong. A hiss slithered up from the depths, invisible but alive. Ethan turned, his voice rising above the clamor. "Out! Everyone, out!" They stumbled past him, shoving one another, boots clattering against gravel. The sheriff cursed. The foreman screamed for order, but panic has no master. By the time the last man stumbled into the gray light, the ground beneath their feet trembled. A groan rippled from deep in the shaft. Then silence. And then the explosion hit. A thunderclap of air and dust burst from the tunnel, knocking men to the ground, flattening tents, slamming crates across the yard. The earth itself seemed to roar. A wave of noxious gas followed, thick, heavy, burning throats, raw. Naya dropped her water pail when the sound struck her chest. She ran toward the chaos, ignoring the men shouting at her to stay back. Smoke coiled from the shaft like a black serpent. Ethan was gone inside. She pushed through the crowd, her braid whipping behind her scarf pulled over her mouth. "Thomas!" She screamed, voice muffled, lungs already stinging. The men tried to hold her, but she was smaller, faster, and grief had sharpened her into something no hands could hold. She dove into the dark. The tunnel was a mouth choking on its own breath. The hiss of gas grew louder, rocks cracked and shifted. Visibility was nothing but ash and smoke. She stumbled over a fallen lantern, its flames snuffed. Then movement, a body sprawled near the edge, half buried in dust, his arm bent under him at a terrible angle. "Ethan!" She gasped, dropping to her knees. His face was pale, lips tinged, blue eyes fluttering. He coughed once, twice, then sagged again. The hiss grew louder. Another tremor rippled beneath them. They had seconds, maybe less. Naya pulled the rope from her satchel, the coarse hand-woven cord she'd braided days ago to bundle firewood. She looped it beneath his arms, slung the ends across her shoulders, and braced herself. Her muscles screamed. The ground quaked. Dust rained from above, blinding her. She dug her heels into gravel and dragged Ethan. It was heavy, his boots catching on rocks, his chest rising only in shallow jerks. She clenched her teeth until her jaw felt splintered. "Not like this," she growled through the scarf. "You don't get to leave me here." Behind them a beam cracked, groaned and collapsed, sealing off the deeper passage with a shudder that rattled her bones. She did not stop. When they finally broke into the open air, the camp erupted. Men shouted, some surged forward, others stumbled back, coughing, spitting blood-streaked phlegm. "Get back!" Naya snarled, pulling Ethan tight against her. "He needs air!" She laid him on the dirt, pressing her hand to his chest, begging his ribs to rise. Her own lungs burned, tears streaking through the ash on her cheeks. "Come back," she whispered, shaking him. "Don't you dare leave me now." For a heartbeat, nothing. Then Ethan coughed a harsh, desperate sound. He gasped, pulling air in ragged bursts, his chest heaving like a bellows, refusing to die. Relief broke her racking sobs she hadn't thought her body remembered how to make. She bowed over him, clutching his soot-covered shirt. By sunset, the mine was sealed with wooden beams and iron locks. Company men declared it inoperable, unsafe. 2 miners had died inside. Several more were injured, but the engineer lived, dragged out by the girl the camp had called nothing more than property. That night, the infirmary smelled of alcohol and lye. Ethan lay with his head bandaged, ribs wrapped, breath shallow but steady. Naya sat at his side, her hair caked with dust, her hands blistered raw from rope and rock. She did not move. She watched his face, the slackness of his mouth, the way his hand twitched when the pain bit through sleep. When his eyes finally opened, dazed and heavy, he turned his head and found her there. "You..." His voice rasped like gravel. "You dragged me." She nodded, tears burning again. "I told you," she whispered. "You don't owe me. But I could not lose you." His hand shifted weakly, searching until it found hers. His grip was faint, but it was steady. "You saved me," he said. "No," she answered. "We saved each other." The lamplight flickered, throwing their shadows long against the infirmary wall. And for the first time since the mine had carved itself into this land, there was proof that something could be pulled out of the dark alive. Night came with the smell of lye and lamp oil, a thin antiseptic hope trying to mask the stink of burned air. The infirmary's canvas sighed at every gust. Ethan slept in fits, the white of bandage against the soot still clinging to his hairline gauze like frost along his ribs. Naya sat in a chair that wobbled on one short leg and refused to blink when her eyes burned. She kept the rope, the same hand-braided cord she had looped under his arms, coiled in her lap, its fibers dark with dust and the sweat of dragging a life out of a hole. He surfaced from pain the way a man comes up from deep water, slow, shuddering, unsure the air is real. She steadied the tin cup to his mouth. He drank a little, coughed, sank back. His hand fumbled for hers and found it as if the map of his body had been rearranged and she was the only landmark left in place. Breathe, she said, because sometimes the body needed permission. In, out, in Ethan. He obeyed, and the room remembered how to be a room instead of a held breath. Morning dragged its boots through the flap. The company doctor checked his pulse with 2 fingers, and a dissatisfaction he reserved for men who insisted on surviving. The mine sheriff hovered hat-low, chewing at a toothpick that had once been a match. The foreman stood with arms crossed, jaw parked like a mule. Naya rose, set herself between them and the bed without seeming to. Lucky, the doctor muttered, pressing the ribs with a little more curiosity than mercy. Ethan's wince pleased him with its clarity. Bruising's bad. Coughed enough gas to scorch the lungs. He'll live if he listens. The foreman's gaze moved to Naya, then back to Ethan. What the hell were you doing past the barricade, pulling men out? Ethan rasped, voice sandpapered. And not signing your blast. The sheriff's mouth tipped, not quite a smile. You like making my mornings lively. Beckett. Naya felt the attention tilt toward her like a loaded cart. She went in, the foreman said, chin jerking. Against orders. Interfered with operations. Operations? Naya asked, calm as a still stove. Breathing is an operation now. The sheriff's eyes flicked amused despite himself. The foreman's cheeks went a dull, angry red. She saved my life, Ethan said low. And likely 2 more. You can write that down or not. It remains true. Truth don't weigh much against contracts, the foreman shot back. We'll be answering to men who never left a chair, and they like paper. Paper says your assistant ain't cleared to step in a shaft. Paper says you're on warning. Paper says losses need names. Put mine, Ethan said. Naya's hand tightened around the rope in her lap until the fibers impressed themselves in her skin like a brand. The sheriff lifted the flap as if tired of the smell of righteousness. Vent it. Lock it. Nobody dies in there again on my watch. His eyes slid to Naya. Girl, you got edges. Try not to cut yourself on them. When they were gone, the room exhaled. Ethan's breath shivered, then steadied. Naya wrung out the cloth in the basin and laid its cool across his brow. A bruise shaded his ribs, the kind that makes a man hold his breath between movements, as if to outwait pain. She mixed a dab of salve comfrey leaf, pounded soft with bear fat, her mother's medicine, and worked it tenderly along the purpling skin. It draws heat out, she whispered. It will help you sleep. He watched her. Without the guard of his usual silence, the watching was naked gratitude sitting beside something more frightened, something that understood debt and hated it. I won't let them write you as the wrong thing, he said. Men have been writing me as the wrong thing since I was 5, she said. No bitterness, only inventory. I learned to read around their letters. He closed his eyes either from the balm or the truth. When he opened them again, they had steadied. They want a report, he said. They want numbers to turn into orders and orders to turn into graves. I need you to take this down. She fetched his pencil in a sheaf of scrapbacks of requisition forms, a corner of a map that had outlived its vein. He dictated slow each sentence like a stalk driven into mud so the rest would have something to hold. Readings from the gauge over 3 days. The sound of the rock, damp turning sour. The exhale that comes before bad air decides to stop pretending to be air. His recommendation halt. Vent. Live. When his voice flagged, she read back what she had written in a careful square hand that had learned in dust and remembered everything. He nodded, made 2 changes, closed his eyes again. Outside the camp had grown a new noise, a mutter that was not quite respect and not quite fear. Men who would not meet her eyes 2 days ago left a scrap of bread on the infirmary step. Another placed a flask where she would find it and walked away fast like kindness was a crime. Still others spat as she passed. She learned their mouths gratitude's tight-line hatred's loose one. The man with the broken arm limped by late in the afternoon, sling at his shoulder, face green with pain and with the thought of it. He stopped just long enough to let his gaze take hold of her like a hand. "You cost me," he said. "You'll heal," she answered. "So will grudges." She tended the stove, stitched and restitched the same hem when her hands needed the lie of busyness. Between small labors, she watched Ethan sleep. He slept like a man long ambushed by his own night's startle, caught in his shoulders even when he surrendered. Once he murmured a name that was not hers. Once his hand flinched in air as if to catch something falling. She eased it back to the blanket and pretended not to hear grief unspool its thread. At dusk, the light outside turned the ridge to a band of copper. She stepped out for air and found the world doing its ordinary work, wine drawing lines in dust, a boy chasing a tin hoop, two crows disputing a crust on a barrel lid. On their guy line, someone had tied another message, a twist of rag knotted into a noose, its meaning unambiguous. She untied it. She smoothed it flat. She folded it into a square and tucked it beneath a stone. There are things you bury and things you burn. This she buried. Back inside, Ethan was awake, his breath a little less shallow, the lamplight finding the angle of his cheek like a memory. She poured broth. He sipped. He watched her over the rim as if realizing the word assistant had never fit her mouth. "I was wrong," he said, and the words were the kind that taste strange because a man doesn't get to say them often, about thinking I had nothing left that could break. There is more. Somehow that feels... He searched for the word, found it with a kind of embarrassed relief. Alive. She looked at her hands. Rope burn ringed her palms, dark as bracelets. "Alive costs," she said. He smiled, tired and real. "So does dead." He slept again. Night deepened until even the men who measured their worth by how loud they could laugh had run out of voice. Naya sat at the cot's edge and let the quiet speak. It said, "You are in the middle of a story, not the end." It said there are storms you cannot outrun, and there are storms that pass because you refuse to run. It said debt is a word men use when they do not know how to receive. The rope in her lap felt heavier, each strand a choice. She followed it in her mind back through the morning, her hands finding purchase where there was none, her shoulders pulling a body that had decided to be too still, her breath bargaining with air that didn't want to be shared. It landed her where truth waited with its open, unkind palm. Trouble had followed her to this tent. Trouble had found him standing in front of her in a mess hall and broken its arm on his refusal. Trouble had taken the shape of notes and nails and nooses of contracts and men who worshipped paper. Trouble would come again. Some of it would wear her face to everyone who'd already chosen the wrong story about her. She rose quietly so the chair would not complain. She moved through the small space that had become more than canvas and dirt. She touched the little iron stove. She touched the place on the wall where the sunflower should be, only then remembering it hung not here but in their tent. She closed her eyes and saw it anyway, the seam across its heart glinting like a promise or a warning. She packed slowly, like a person learning to leave without breaking things. The satchel swallowed a change of dress, the bone needle that had been her mother's, a heel of bread, a little tin of salve, the coil of rope. She hesitated over the requisition slip on the crate, the one that had been stamped with a brass seal strong enough to make men pretend to honor it. She laid it flat, weighed it with a stone as if to keep it from following her and spoiling its power. She wrote after 3 tries that tore in the middle from too much hand a note small enough to hide between breaths. "I will not be what hurts you." The words looked like stealing. She folded them until they were a square barely visible between her fingertips and slid them beneath the cup on the crate where he'd find them by accident and know they had been deliberate. Before she left, she stood over him, hands hovering, unsure the world allowed her the kindness she wanted. She settled for the oldest right, the one without words. She laid her palm over his hand so lightly the skin barely remembered it, and then she lifted away. Outside, the pre-dawn had taken the color out of everything and left only shape. Tents hunched like animals. The ridge wore a collar of low cloud. Somewhere something metal clanged once and stopped. She pulled her scarf up, set the satchel on her shoulder, and stepped into the wind. The camp did not look different from any other morning. The difference lived under her ribs, a tightness that felt like the ache before a scar. She walked the long way, skirting the mess tent and the administrative shack cutting behind a rank of barrels where the smell of brine made her think of rivers she had not seen in years. At the supply yard, the tarp flapped like a giant crow, and she moved under its wing a moment to tie her boots tighter. She looked back once. The infirmary's lantern was a small coin in a gray throat. She pressed 2 fingers to her lips, then to the air between her and that little light, as if a gesture could be a bridge. Bloom, she whispered to the place where the sunflower hung in a different tent. Even if I go. Then she turned her face toward the trail that led out toward a horizon that had never promised and therefore had not lied. When the first thin seam of morning opened above the ridge, Naya was already a moving shadow, and the camp, its notes, its nails, its men who loved paper, and the hurt it could do was a smear behind her boots. The wind was merciless at the edge of Stratton Ridge, sweeping down the trail in ragged gusts that scoured the earth bare. Naya leaned into it, her satchel slung tight against her side, her braid whipping like a black tail. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of the satchel, but because of what she carried inside her chest. Guilt, fear, and a strange ache that wasn't quite grief but wasn't far from it. She had walked away before, from villages, from caravans, from men who traded her name like currency. But this leaving felt different. This time she wasn't fleeing fists or fire. She was fleeing a kindness she did not know how to pay back. And that somehow was worse. Behind her, the camp shrank into a smear of tents and smoke. Ahead, the land stretched bare frozen mud and dust, sagebrush clawing through rock, a horizon that looked like it wanted nothing to do with her. Naya. The voice cut through the wind like a whip crack. She froze. Her heart hammered as she turned. Ethan Beckett stood only yards behind his coat, flapping open, one arm bound against his ribs. His face was pale, jaw clenched against pain, but his stride had the kind of determination that broke stone when reason failed. Her throat tightened. "You should be in bed." He stopped just short of her breath, ragged. "Where the hell are you going?" She clutched the strap of her satchel. "Back to nothing, to where I came from, to anywhere that isn't here." "Why?" His voice cracked raw with something more than anger. Because it was a debt, she snapped her words sharper than she meant. "You carried it when it was mine. I was sent here to be sold, used, passed around like a coin. You put your name on a slip of paper and stood in the way of that. But I should not have let you. I should have left the first night." Ethan's eyes narrowed, fury and pain rising in equal measure. "So that's it. You vanish because you think you owe me something." Her chin trembled. "I do owe you. And I can't pay it, not with cleaning, not with stew, not even with loyalty. I'm nothing but trouble to you." He stepped closer, his boots crunching on frost-hardened dirt, his breath plumed white between them. "You think I gave a damn about stew?" His voice was low-cutting. "You think I pulled you out of their hands because I needed my tent swept?" She looked away, tears stinging her eyes. "You think this was pity?" His voice broke raw. "That I saved you because I had no one left to save." Her shoulders hunched. She wanted to run, but her feet refused. The truth in his voice pinned her where no rope ever had. He closed the last distance between them, his voice trembling now, not with anger, but with something dangerously close to pleading. "You are not a debt, Naya. You are not a burden. You are the only thing in that tent that hasn't turned to ash." Her lips parted, her breath caught. "You made the place feel alive again," he went on, his voice breaking like stone splitting under frost. "I come home and there is warmth, a bed that smells like wild sage, a drawing of a flower on the wall that refuses to give up. I thought I'd buried every reason to stay alive. And then you." She shook her head, but the tears fell anyway. "I didn't think I was worth staying for." He raised his hand not to touch her, but to show her something. From his coat he drew the sunflower cloth, its seam stitched, the petals still crooked but intact. He held it out like proof. "I fixed this," he said hoarsely, "because I couldn't stand the sight of it broken. And I can't stand the thought of you gone." Her tears blurred the cloth into gold smears. The wind clawed at her sleeves, tugging her toward the horizon. She let her satchel slip from her shoulder. It fell into the dirt with a thud. Ethan caught her as she folded into him, his arms wrapping around her as though she were the last solid thing left in a collapsing world. He held her like she was real, not temporary. not a kindness borrowed against despair. And she held him back, not out of gratitude, not out of fear, but because, for the first time in her life, she believed she was allowed to. The wind howled around them, carrying away the sound of her sobs, but not the weight of what passed between them. They walked back to the tent together. Ethan leaned heavier on her than he admitted, and she steadied him with a strength she hadn't known she still carried. Inside the stove had gone cold, the curtain sagged, the lantern guttered low. Yet the space didn't feel empty anymore. Naya took off her gloves, set them on the crate, and knelt to coax the fire alive. Ethan sat at the table, the mended sunflower cloth spread before him. He pressed it flat with his palm as though grounding it into the fabric of the world. Neither spoke for a long time, but silence had changed its nature again. It wasn't distance, it was a bridge wide enough for two. When night came, he lowered the lamp until the glow was soft against the canvas. He lay down on his cot with a groan, one arm over his ribs. She curled behind the curtain, listening to his breathing. It was rough, uneven, but it was there. Her fingers brushed the rope coiled at her bedside. She thought of the shaft collapsing, of dragging him inch by inch into air, of his voice on the trail. "You are not a debt." For the first time since she was 5, hiding under a pile of skins, Naya believed it. The seam in her chest held. Days bled into one another, yet something fragile and unmistakable had shifted in the air around them. The camp outside remained sharp, cruel, and full of whispers, but inside Ethan's tent there grew a rhythm. Not comfort, not ease, but something quieter. Something that allowed breath to exist without panic. Naya rose before dawn as always. She stoked the stove until it glowed orange and hissed like a small dragon. She folded Ethan's maps when the wind tore them across the table, kneaded dough from the coarse flour she'd bartered, and mended torn cuffs with steady hands. Her body moved through the tasks of survival, but her heart began to move with something else, an odd warmth, the first roots of belonging. Ethan noticed without saying so. He no longer drank from the bottle hidden near his cot. He no longer worked until his hands cramped into claws. Some nights after supper, he stepped outside and sat quietly on a crate, simply listening to the wind and the rare sound of her laugh when something went wrong with her stew and she teased herself for it. It wasn't love, not yet. It was the stillness of two wounded souls learning they could exist in the same space without tearing each other apart. But the camp noticed too. Whispers grew sharper. Men stared when she carried water, when she passed with clean laundry folded against her chest. Some looks were envy, others contempt, and more than a few were the kind that made her pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders and walk faster. At the mess tent one evening, voices rose as miners argued over cards. A sneer carried across the room. Beckett's got himself a Comanche wife without paying a dime. Laughter followed, jagged and mean. Naya kept her eyes on the pot she scrubbed, pretending not to hear, but the words knifed into her. Back in the tent, she tried to mask it, humming under her breath as she folded his shirt. Ethan glanced up from his notes, his pencil frozen mid-sentence. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened, and she knew he'd heard the whispers too. Later that night, he paused by the sunflower cloths tacked to the wall. The stitched one and the newer one she had drawn crooked but bold. They trembled in the draft like twin guardians. Ethan stared at them for a long moment before blowing out the lamp. The silence in the tent was no longer hollow. It was a silence that held. The days lengthened, but unease grew. The engineers spoke in hushed tones about the shafts. Gauges twitched wild. Gas seeped like a rumor through the stone. Ethan worked longer hours in the tunnels, his breath sour with worry, when he returned. Naya patched his sleeves where rock tore them, listening in silence as he muttered about bad readings and careless orders. One night, when he returned late, his face streaked with dust, she set stew in front of him. He stared at it without eating. "They won't wait," he muttered finally. "They'll blast through before the venting's done. They want silver more than they want lungs." She sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "And you?" His eyes lifted, pale and unblinking. "I want us alive." The words hung between them, heavier than any rock. He finally ate slow and methodical. She watched him, her chest tight with something she couldn't yet name. When he was done, she brought out a small scrap of fabric she had been hiding. On it, she had drawn another sunflower, this one taller, its petals reaching upward as though straining toward light. She pinned it beside the others. Ethan studied it, his lips pressing into a line. Why another? Her voice was steady. Because one isn't enough to hold a place. You plant them together, so if one falls, another still stands. He looked at her a long moment, then back at the cloth. Something in his shoulders eased just slightly. That night he lay on his cot staring at the ceiling, listening to her even breaths behind the curtain. His ribs ached, but there was a different ache pressing harder. The realization that she was no longer simply an assistant, no longer just a girl he had saved. She had become part of the air in his lungs, the reason he breathed slower, steadier. Naya, in her corner, traced the seam on the rope with her finger. She remembered the shaft collapsing, the weight of him dragging her backward into the dark, and the desperate strength it had taken to pull him back into air. She realized then he was not just someone she owed. He was someone she could not let go. The camp laughed sharper the next day, but neither of them carried it inside the tent. Instead, as evening fell, Ethan sat outside lantern dim, listening to the sound of the ridge breathing. Naya joined him, her shawl drawn tight, her shoulder brushing his without meaning to. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. For the first time in a long, long while, silence felt like hope. Morning didn't so much arrive as pry the night open with a dull knife. A thin light leaked across Stratton Ridge, catching on frost-rimmed ropes and the shine of spilled coal. The camp woke the way a wounded animal wakes, suspicious, angry, ready to bite what moved. A sheet of paper had been nailed to the administrative shack door. The sheriff's hat brim shadowed it, while a knot of men read aloud to those who couldn't. Shaft 3. Sealed until further notice. Operations paused pending assessment. Pay to be adjusted according to contract. Adjusted meant less. Less meant rage with nowhere lawful to go. Naya stood at the edge of the crowd, shawl pulled close, eyes steady. Every look found her some soft, with something like respect, others sharpened by the need to blame. A boy no older than 12 slipped past the men and pressed a heel of bread into her hand without looking up. He vanished before she could thank him. Inside the infirmary, Ethan tested his ribs with a breath and found both pain and room beneath it. He sat up, swung his feet to the floor, and closed his hand around the cot's edge until the room's spin remembered its manners. The doctor told him what men always told other men when reality inconvenienced them. "You're not made of glass," then added grudgingly, "but don't try to be iron either." He made it as far as the door before the foreman intercepted him. Behind the foreman stood a man in a city coat, clean angry at dirt for touching him, a ledger under his arm like a narrow coffin. "Ethan Beckett," the city man said, looking as if he'd been warned that Ethan might be contagious. "Crispin Hale, company oversight." Oversight said everything a man who arrived after the damage and spoke as if he'd been there first. "We'll need your statement." Hale continued, "and your signature on a report clarifying procedural failures." "Shareholder language. Language that blames air for being air," the sheriff muttered from his place by the steps. Hale didn't flinch. "Language that keeps the camp open and the legal exposure closed." He offered a measured smile to Ethan. "You're valuable. Let's be practical." Ethan leaned against the doorframe, color thin in his cheeks, eyes pale and unamused. Practical starts with not killing men to prove a mine can still spit silver. Practical, Hale said, starts with names. Someone signs. Someone owns it. Someone goes. His gaze flicked once toward Naya, where she stood with the boy's bread in her hand. "The board is troubled by non-compliant personnel in restricted areas. She dragged 2 men out alive," the sheriff said. "My count says that's compliance with breathing." Hale's smile didn't move. "The ledger reads differently." "The ledger can learn to read," Ethan said, voice low. "I gave warnings. I logged the gauges. You sat wherever you sit and imagine rock behaves for men who haven't met it." Hale's eyes narrowed. For a breath, the mask slid. "Write me something I can use, Mr. Beckett." "I already have," Ethan said. "It says halt, vent live." Silence thinned the air between the men. Hale adjusted a cuff with surgical precision. "You're on leave while we decide whether your position still exists. A wagon will take any personal effects you want out by week's end." He turned as if the matter had completed itself, then added with the casual cruelty of a man who practices cruelty until it sounds like policy. "The girl is to be reassigned. Kitchen, officially." Keeps things simple. Naya's fingers tightened around the bread until it cracked. The sound was small and loud at once. Ethan straightened pain forgotten long enough to be irrelevant. She stays with me until her paper says otherwise. Hale set his ledger on his hip. That paper is mine to write. Try, the sheriff said, and the word came out like a door bolt. We're breathing because she didn't wait for your pen. Something like calculation moved behind Hale's eyes, numbers meeting will, and deciding they weren't ready to fight both. We'll revisit, he said. He left without turning his back, which was a kind of respect or a kind of caution. Here they passed for the same thing. The crowd dissolved into work that wasn't quite workmen hauling what didn't need hauling, fixing what wasn't broken, making noise that kept them from hearing their own thoughts. Naya carried the bread to the tent and set it on a plate, as if honoring an offering makes it multiply. She swept soot that had drifted in, righted a stool that had learned to list on one leg, and lifted the sunflower cloths to dust them with a gentle shake. The stitched seam caught light and answered with its thin, stubborn gleam. Ethan came in slow, a hand at his ribs, the rest of him still moving like a man who could be persuaded not to fall. He sat where the lamp had burned a small, honest circle into the canvas wall over the months. For a while he said nothing. The space said it for him, the made bed, the stove whose iron remembered their hands, the flowers on the wall leaning always toward the idea of sun. I won't let them write your page, he said at last. They've been writing it for years, she answered, soft but unmistakable. But I've been writing in the margins. He smiled, tired and unsteady and true. Then let's give them more margins than page. A shadow crossed the flap. The miner with the sling stood there, face sallow. Anger, a bruise his pride wouldn't let him treat. For a heartbeat, it looked like the night in the mess would replay itself in daylight. Then he glanced at Ethan's bandages. He glanced at Naya's hands, knuckles grazed raw rope, burns still livid, his mouth twisted. He spat into the dirt, but not toward them. You pulled my kid brother too, he said, looking at nobody. He's too stupid to say thanks. He backed away before gratitude could stain him. Naya exhaled a breath she didn't know she'd been strangling. Ethan looked at the door for a long time after the sling disappeared, as if a different life had stood there and chosen not to come in. She set water to boil. The first bubbles were small and tentative. Then the pot found its voice and said what boiling always says, change is happening, even if it looks like waiting. She mixed flour with a little lard kneaded shaped. Her hands on dough were steadier than her heart, which insisted on learning new beats. Eat, she told Ethan, and he did, because refusing food now would have felt like refusing the terms of his own rescue. In the afternoon, the sheriff posted a second notice under the first. A single sentence with a weight longer than it looked. No retaliation. I will know. The men read it and laughed too loud like boys daring one another to run past a graveyard, but they kept their hands mostly to themselves. A few even tipped their heads when Naya passed a gesture that wasn't respect and wasn't quite apology, but might grow up to be both. As the sun slanted low, a wagon rattled into camp, its wheels complaining about the ruts. Two company clerks rode the tailboard, faces pinched by the effort of being better than the place they were in. They carried a canvas satchel stamped with the company seal and a letterbox whose brass had not yet learned what dust was. They asked for Ethan Beckett. The foreman pointed. The wagon rolled to the tent like a verdict, given wheels. One clerk hovered just outside the flap, while the other removed an envelope and cleared his throat in the way of men who never did anything without a preface. By instruction of this board, he read, Engineer Ethan Beckett is offered temporary reassignment to Survey Line North Providence Plain under Superintendent Markham. Terms to include hazard pay lodging and authority over crew selection. Effective upon acceptance. He held out the envelope like a plate. Ethan didn't reach for it at first. He looked at Naya instead. The glance was quick and entire, a question that didn't need language. The clerk shifted, then tried kindness the way you try a coat you suspect won't suit you. Sir, it's a good post. Better air. Fewer events? Ethan took the letter. The seal gave under his thumb with a little sigh, as if wax could be relieved. He read. His face didn't change much. Real thinking doesn't always show. When he finished, he folded the paper and slid it back into its sleeve. When do they want an answer? He asked. Wagon heads north at week's end, the clerk said. You could follow tomorrow if you're, mobile. His gaze ticked to the bandages as if pain were a scheduling inconvenience. When the clerks left, the tent felt briefly larger, as if the air had leaned out to listen, and then decided not to stay. Naya set the envelope on the crate, the same crate that had once held whiskey, and now held work gloves oiled and ready, and a coil of rope that had done holy labor. It's far, she said, not asking. Far enough the wind learns a new name, Ethan answered. He sat the letter between his fingers and looked at the sunflower cloths as if seeking counsel from things that only ever turn toward light. Better ground. No shafts chewing men. Work that builds instead of hollows. He didn't say the word go. He said we without saying it. Naya watched his face, every line of it carved by rock and grief and the wrong kind of silence. She had lived too long in places where men called the world theirs and meant you were part of the furniture. This was different. Her life wasn't being arranged. It was being asked. She tasted the shape of an answer and felt its truth shock her like cold water. But answers offered too quickly can scare hope back into the brush. She folded a cloth, slowed the motion, let the moment breathe. Providence, she said, as if trying the word on her tongue could tell her whether it fit. Do their fields take seed? They say sunflowers grow high as a man, he said. Her mouth softened. Then they'll need hands that know how to plant. He met her eyes. For a heartbeat, everything they had not said yet stood gentle as a deer between them. Then he nodded once, a vow with no witnesses but the stove and the stitched seam catching late light. Outside, the wind lost some of its knife. Someone somewhere found a harmonica and asked it to remember a tune. The camp, still cruel, still precarious, tilted half a degree toward something safer in the knowledge that a few of its people would slip through its teeth. Ethan slid the letter beneath the small tin box on the shelf, the one that held a photograph faded by heat and breath. He set his fingers on the lid, not to close the past, but to promise it company. Tomorrow, he said. We'll tell them. Naya stood beside the stove, palm flattened on the warm iron, the old gesture her mother had used when something needed blessing that didn't have a priest. Tomorrow, she agreed. The sunflower cloths trembled once in a draft, and then settled as if the canvas itself had decided to hold them steadier. Night edged in, soft as a secret. Inside the tent, two people sat with a letter between them and the kind of quiet that means yes. The next dawn cracked the horizon with a gray so heavy it looked carved out of iron. Frost rimmed every rope in camp. Each canvas flap stiffened like it had grown armor against the wind. Naya woke before the first shout, her breath a cloud above her face. For a moment she lay still, listening to the slow cadence of Ethan's breathing behind the curtain. He was alive. That was enough to make the cold less sharp. She rose, coaxed the stove to life with kindling, and stirred the coals until they glowed like a handful of buried rubies. She poured water, chopped onion with hands that had learned to move faster than thought, and set the pan on the heat. The scent filled the tent, soft and defiant, like daring the camp to remember that life could taste better than smoke. Ethan emerged stiff but moving. His ribs bound his skin pale. Yet his eyes were clearer than they had been in months. He watched her quietly, as though trying to memorize the way she looked bent over a pot in the dawn light. "You should rest," she said, not turning from the stove, "and miss the foreman's face when I tell him no." His voice was low, but the faintest curl of humor bent its edge. Naya looked over her shoulder. He had shaved badly, a nick at his jaw still weeping a line of red, but he wore his coat like a man who had decided to stand in the world rather than endure it. They ate together slower than usual. Every bite was a delay, an unspoken stalling of the moment when words would have to become choices. By mid-morning, they walked side by side through the camp toward the administrative shack. The letter from Providence sat folded in Ethan's pocket, heavy as iron despite its thin paper. Naya's shawl wrapped tight around her, the sunflower seam stitched like a secret inside. Men watched them. Some tipped their heads. Others scowled. More than one spat, though the spit landed in the dirt instead of at her feet. The miner with the sling leaned against a barrel, his face twisted in discomfort, his eyes holding something like apology he couldn't name. He didn't speak. That was its own kind of truce. Inside the shack, the air stank of ink and cold coffee. The foreman sat hunched over ledgers, his scowl carved deep enough to last decades. Beside him stood Crispin Hale's city coat, pressed sharp ledger tucked under his arm. His smile, a blade turned flat. "You've considered," Hale said smoothly. "I have," Ethan answered. Hale extended his hand palm up, expecting the signed acceptance, like a priest collecting tithe. Instead, Ethan pulled the letter out slowly and laid it flat on the desk. "We'll take it," he said. "But she comes with me." Silence. A silence that weighed more than any words. The foreman barked a laugh. "You think the board's paying hazard for some Comanche girl to follow a man's tent?" Hale's smile didn't waver, but his eyes narrowed. That was not part of the offer. "Then the offer isn't worth taking," Ethan said. Naya stood at his shoulder, her face calm, though her hands trembled beneath the folds of her shawl. "She dragged me out of the shaft," Ethan continued. "She kept this camp from burying 2 more men. She keeps my work in order. She is the reason you're not writing my obituary in that ledger you love so much. You send me north, you send her. Or you find another man ready to sign paper over corpses." The foreman slammed his fist against the desk, coffee sloshing. "Careful, Beckett." Ethan leaned forward, his voice calm, steady, immovable. "No, you be careful. You need engineers. You need men who know rock from rumor. You don't need me specifically, but you want me. And I don't walk north without her." The sheriff, leaning against the back wall with his toothpick, finally chuckled. "Sounds like your ledger's got itself a condition, Hale." Hale's jaw tightened. He opened the letter as though by reading it again he could erase what had already been said aloud. Then he closed it with deliberate precision. "Fine," he said. "Providence Plain. Both names, temporary. The board will see it as an indulgence, nothing more. But one mistake, one incident, and she's gone." Ethan didn't blink. "Then there won't be mistakes." Naya's heart thudded so loud she thought they might hear it, but she kept her face still the way her mother had taught her. Strength can be quiet. They left the shack together. Outside, the wind had shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of thaw. That evening, Naya packed their few belongings: a tin box with a faded photograph, a coil of rope, the stitched sunflower cloths. She folded them gently, tucking them into the satchel as though they were not scraps but roots. Ethan sat nearby, organizing his tools with a precision that masked the tremor in his hands. Every wrench, every compass, every pencil had its place. It wasn't about order. It was about holding control in a world that had tried to take it. As the lamp flickered low, he looked at her across the small tent. "Will you come with me?" She didn't answer with words. She reached for his hand, calloused and scarred, and held it like a vow. When dawn broke again, the wagon waited at the edge of camp. Its wheels creaked, impatient. Men watched as Ethan climbed aboard with his satchel, then turned when Naya followed and took her seat beside him without hesitation. Whispers rose, but no one moved to stop them. As the wagon lurched forward, the camp fell behind its tents, shrinking into shapes against the ridge. Naya looked back once, then forward, her hand still in Ethan's. The road ahead was long, the land vast and unknown. But for the first time in years, she felt as though she wasn't walking toward nothing. She was walking toward something she had chosen. The road north, unspooled like a scar, turned pale by distance. The wagon rattled through sage and snow patches, past cottonwoods, scribbling the sky with black fingers over shallow fords where the water flashed, and then went on pretending nothing had crossed it. Naya sat beside Ethan, the bench vibrating her bones, the air slicing her cheeks clean. The farther they went, the more the ridge shrank behind them, until Stratton was only a memory of canvas and smoke in a land that was learning to forgive itself. They traveled with 2 teamsters and a boy who whistled like he was trying to convince the wind it could be friendly. The boy offered Naya a twist of jerky without looking directly at her. She took it and gave him the heel of bread the camp boy had pressed into her palm the day before. He chewed slowly, eyes wide at the barter, as if he'd been allowed to trade with fate itself. Ethan didn't speak much. He kept one hand over his ribs and the other on the sideboard, face weathered into a kind of watchfulness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with taking measure. He was measuring the sky, the lay of the ground, the distance between one life and the next. By the 3rd evening, the land began to soften. Hills fell away to a great flat where the wind could run without breaking, and the horizon didn't threaten so much as promise. Providence Plain. A line shack, a water tower, a scatter of low buildings silvered by distance, and a row of poplars that had learned to stand together. The smell changed: less smoke, more wet soil, the tang of iron turned into tools instead of coffins. They rumbled into a camp that wasn't a camp so much as a starting place survey post staked like exclamation points, a barn roof mended with care, a cookhouse that didn't try to hide its onions. Men looked up, looked away. No one jeered. No one smiled for free either. This was a place where work argued first and niceties were a language you learned later. Superintendent Markham met them in a jacket too thin for the air and a hat too stubborn to come off. He shook Ethan's hand with a grip that said he had opinions but preferred facts. His glance slid to Naya, paused, didn't linger long enough to turn into trouble. "You're Beckett Markham," said the name, tasting like he'd already read Ethan's cautions in some office a month too late. "I liked your report more than the Ledger boys did. I like keeping men above ground. You set grade-lay culverts, keep the crews from arguing with water. Air's better here. Trouble's different. It comes from sky and river, not the earth's gut." Ethan's mouth tipped the smallest degree. "I can argue with both." Markham nodded toward Naya without the show of it meaning more than sense. "They said the girl is your assistant." The word girl carried no sneer, only a habit. "Kitchen can put her on books, or she can stay out of the way of mule hooves and men with wide elbows. We've got a tools shed empty, as a sermon after Sunday. That'll do for you two while the crew puts up something proper." "She stays with me," Ethan said, an old decision spoken like new air. Markham looked at them a long second, then at the plane that went on and on. "Water runs in a ditch if you give it one," he said, which counted for yes. "You want a corner of it, build the banks." The tools shed was not much 4 walls out of square a door that had to choose between closing and being honest about itself. But it had a stove that would remember fire and a window that faced east. Naya set their satchel on a crate and unrolled the sunflower cloths. She did not hang them yet. She leaned them where the morning would find them and tell the walls their names. Ethan set his tool chest down with a carefulness that had nothing to do with weight. He opened it, touched each piece like a prayer compass. Level plumb a pocket notebook with grit rubbed into its creases. When he shut the lid, the sound was small and complete. They worked at once because staying still in a new place can make the past too loud. Ethan planed a warped board until curls of pale wood fell like shavings of moonlight. Naya swept, then scrubbed the floor with sand and water until the planks remembered they had grain. She set a pot of beans to soak the first supper greatly improved by the promise of tomorrow. In the morning, Markham walked the line with Ethan stakes string the whisper of level bubbles deciding what this side of the ditch owed the other. He let Ethan choose 2 men for his crew, and Ethan chose quiet men whose eyes checked the sky before their mouths checked other men. One was named Ortiz and had hands like spades. The other answered to Pike and carried a roll of twine like a talisman. Naya learned their names the way you learn what will break if dropped. While they argued with slope and solvency, Naya made the shed into a room. She traded with the cook for flour and lard, scrubbed a pane of glass until it didn't grimace, and cut a square of old canvas into a curtain that looked braver than it was. At midday she carried a pail to the river, a ribbon of brown-green that moved as if it remembered mountains, and came back with hair damp and eyes clearer. At the trading post, a door 2 barrels, and a man with a pencil, she found a cotton sack half full of seeds miscounted or misbagged. The label had been worn to a ghost, but the seeds themselves were fat-striped familiar. She rolled a few in her palm, felt their heft, smiled without showing it. The trader squinted at her, decided to treat it like any other barter, and let them go for a loaf and a mended shirt. She carried the sack home like good news you weren't ready to name out loud. That evening, when the light slanted so low, it turned splinters to gold, she took a hoe and a dented tin cup outside the shed. The ground was stubborn where it had been trampled, but a few yards out it gave like a body that wanted to be held. She pressed her heel into the soil, felt the memory of water not far below. She knelt. Her hands moved without ceremony. A shallow furrow. A seed. The press of earth. She worked in a line, then another spacing by guess and instinct, and the measure of a foot she trusted. The first row ate the whole cup, the second row the next. She was not careful. Careful is for ladies with yards. She was attentive. Attentive is for people who had been denied every small choice and now took this one like a sacrament. Ethan came up quiet behind her. He watched without interrupting, as if a wrong word could scare something off. Sunflowers, he said, finally, though he knew. She sat back on her heels, breath clouding in the cool. Dirt streaked her palms, her forearms, the hem of her dress. She had never looked more like home. They remember the sun even when the sky forgets to show it. He crouched beside her ribs, complaining, and ignored. "How many as the ground will keep," she said. "As many as the wind will allow." He smiled, and it reached his eyes. "Then the wind is outnumbered." They watered the ground with the river-carried cup by tin cup until the soil darkened and gave off that smell that makes the heart lift wet dirt, telling you that bruised things can take. When they went back inside, Naya's hands shook with a tremor that wasn't exhaustion. Planting is a dangerous hope. It commits the future in a place that has not earned it. They ate beans and onion and a heel of last day's bread, and it tasted like a beginning pretending to be an ordinary meal. After she wiped the tin box with the faded photograph and set it on a shelf, Ethan had hammered straight. She unrolled the sunflower cloth, the one with the seam, and hung it at last. The canvas wall received it like a wound might receive a stitch, and decide fine will hold. Night fell different here. Not the angry dark of a camp waiting for the next shove, but a wide, deep blue that arrived with crickets and a coyote's far opinion and a river that did not care to whisper. Ethan lay down and discovered his body had forgotten the song of sleeping without listening for boots. Naya heard him breathe in and out, then in, and stay. She smiled at the roof on behalf of both of them. Days found their shape. Ethan rose early, took his level, and a coffee that tasted like purpose, and walked the line with Ortiz and Pike. He argued gently with Pitch and insisted culverts be wide enough for what might come in spring rather than what had already passed. He talked to water the way he talked to rock, as an equal that could be persuaded but not ordered. Naya cooked for 3, then 4, then sometimes 6 when men worked too late to remember supper. She taught the cook to boil bones long enough to turn water into medicine. She patched a sleeve for a man who could not stop picking its loose thread. She bartered lessons for flour, how to sew a seam that would not shame you when it was time to wear it out in public. Women came from nowhere in particular, and she showed them how to make a little from less, and how to tighten a stitch when the world insisted on unraveling. She watered the rose morning and evening. Tiny green blades answered shy as foals. She knelt and pressed the sides of each sprout the way her mother had shown her, so the stalks would learn to stand. She talked to them, when no one was listening, nonsense songs with no tune, a story about a girl who told the sun she would find it even in a cave. Sometimes the past tripped a wire. A hammer dropped in the yard and her shoulders leapt without asking her first. A door slammed and Ethan woke from a dream with a hand in the air, like he meant to catch a thing already gone. At those times, they did not pretend. He would sit on the step and breathe until his ribs and memory agreed to let go. She would braid her hair tight and then looser, teaching her fingers that this roof did not burn. In their quiet, the shed learned to hold more than the weight of tools. On a Sunday, no one had agreed was Sunday Markham stopped by. He looked at the line where the ditch would run down past the poplars to a stand of willow. He looked at the rows by the shed where Green had found the idea of up. He dragged a boot toe across a furrow, then put his hands on his hips. "You work like men who plan to stay," he said. Ethan's answer was simple. "We do." Markham's nod was the kind that sealed a barrel. "Then I'll make sure the crew puts up a frame next week. You shouldn't sleep with your tools forever." His gaze slid to the sunflower cloth in the window. "Pretty," he added, and in his mouth the word meant necessary. When he left, the air felt stamped with a small permission, the kind you don't notice until it's missing. Naya stood in the doorway with the sack of seed against her hip and watched the plane consider the sky. As the week turned, the first true leaves split, the shells uncurled and lifted their flat faces. Naya laughed short and surprised the sound ringing off the shed like a new bell finding its metal. Ethan looked up from his notebook, and the smile that came did not apologize for existing. That evening, the light went copper. Naya rinsed dirt from her hands at the barrel and caught Ethan watching her the way a man watches fire he has just remembered how to make. She shook the water off and flicked drops at him. He pretended to be offended. She pretended to believe him. Inside, she turned the window cloth a thumb's width to the left, so the seam caught the last of the sun and glowed like a narrow road no one else could see. She lay on her pallet and listened to the plane breathe a long, slow sound, like a chest that had learned not to be afraid of sleep. Tomorrow would bring fences to mend and a ditch that argued hard where the ground rose for no reason. It would bring a loaf that failed to rise and a second that did, and ankles swallowed by mud and a man named Pike swearing poetry at a stuck wheel. It would bring another row planted and the first hint of a bud thinking about being brave. Providence Plain was not a promise. It was a chance, and the difference between the two was the work you put between them. Naya closed her eyes and felt the work already gathering in her hands and her knees under her nails. In the distance, coyotes conducted their small senate. Up close, Ethan exhaled and stayed asleep. The seeds lay under the earth, learning the dark in order to find the light. Morning laid a thin veil of mist across Providence Plain, the kind that disappears as soon as the sun remembers what it's for. Naya opened the shed door to the smell of wet earth and cut wood to rows of green that had learned the idea of up. Her fingers hovered above the nearest stalk, 2 leaves, then 4, then a slender spine that swore it would be something more. She pressed the soil gently on either side of the stem, the way her mother had taught her to teach the plant to hold its ground against a world that leaned. Ethan stepped out behind her, rubbing sleep out of his eyes with a knuckle. He wore his shirt open at the throat bandage long gone, the ache in his ribs now a dull memory that arrived only when he laughed too hard, a problem Naya found herself tempted to cause. He looked past her shoulder and let out a breath that contained more than air. "They made it through the night," he said. "They made it through this one," she answered. "We keep showing them how to make it through the next." Work scattered them in the cool light. Ethan walked the line with Ortiz and Pike, levels held like instruments at a quiet symphony. Markham had staked a new reach that curved toward the river and asked to be convinced not to drown the low pasture come spring. Ethan's pencil flicked and paused, flicked and paused. The line of water gradually persuaded to go where it would do more good than harm. Naya moved between stove and Rose and the neighboring cookhouse, where a woman named Alma washed tin plates with a determination that made Greece reconsider its options. "You show me that stock again," Alma said, chin tipping toward the pot. Naya had coaxed into a slow-breathing simmer. "I swear I could feed a lumber crew on the smell alone." "You feed men with bones," Naya replied, stirring, and the bones remember. After noon, she hauled the pail to the river boot, slipping at the muddy edge, the water rounding her arms cool as a blessing. A boy with a slingshot watched from under a willow and offered nothing but a shrug and the information that his name was Eli. "They say you saved an engineer with a rope," he blurted when her second bucket sloshed. "I saved a cat from a barrel once." "Both stubborn creatures," she said, and the boy grinned hard enough to show the missing tooth he wasn't ready to mourn. Clouds shouldered the horizon the third afternoon and came on fast, the light flattening wind changing direction like a horse that smelled snake. Pike lifted his head and squinted. "Hail," he said, as if greeting a disliked neighbor. Naya felt it before she saw it, the sudden bite in the air, the stillness that told the plane to brace. She ran for the shed, dragged the stack of burlap sacks she'd set aside for no reason she could name then, and sprinted for the rows. Alma appeared with 2 old quilts from the cookhouse Ortiz with a canvas drop, Pike with a curse and a laugh. Ethan vaulted the ditch line, pain forgotten the way a man forgets weather when the herd breaks. The first stones pinged mean against the shovel leaning by the door, small pellets that made a racket out of all proportion to their size. Then the sky gave its handfuls grudgingly, then freely white knuckles of ice that rattled the roof and stung the skin. Naya dropped to her knees and flung the burlap over the first row hands, pinning the edges with rocks. Ethan covered the second. Pike and Ortiz worked the third and fourth, swearing at the sky in 2 languages, until the sky, unimpressed, grew bigger. "Go in!" Markham shouted from the barn, cupping hands around his mouth. "It's only Sprout." It's not only Naya called back without looking. Some hailstones cracked like thrown marbles against the shovel. One caught Ethan on the shoulder hard enough to ring bone. He hissed, and she glanced up, ready to argue him out of hurting for her, but found his jaw set and his eyes amused at the sky, as if to say, "Is that all?" The storm snarled for another minute. Then, like a bully bored of its own voice, it moved on, trailing insult and cold behind it. They lifted covers carefully. 2 stalks were snapped white marrow, showing like a small betrayal. Most bent, but held the burlap damp and shining. Naya pressed the soil again on either side of each plant, whispering nothing and everything. Alma wrung out a quilt and cackled when a hailstone fell from the fold and skittered into the grass like a rabbit. Ethan touched the welt rising on his shoulder and shrugged when she reached for it with a frown. "It'll bloom yellow," he said. She laughed once, sharp, surprised, then put her hand briefly over that bruise the way she might touch a beam to tell it to carry. 3 days later, the first bud split its green seam. Naya saw it in the slant of late light and didn't believe it at first. Then did all at once with a little sound that reached the road and made Pike look up from a stuck wagon tongue. She dropped her hoe and knelt in the dirt, hands hovering, not touching the way people hover near miracles, in case they break if acknowledged too hard. Ethan heard her laugh, an unguarded burst that sounded like water finding a stone to talk to, and came at a run that made his ribs protest. He skidded to a stop, boots cutting 2 half-moons in the loose soil. The yellow was still tentative petals folded at the edges, but there, undeniable, the face of a thing that refused to apologize for being bright. He crouched beside her, and for a moment neither spoke because the right words would have needed 2 suns. When he did find one, it was small and sufficient. "You did that." She shook her head, smiling, tears threatening and not winning. "We did. The ground did. The water did. The wind let us." He looked at her instead of the flower. Then the dirt smudged along her cheek. The stray hair stuck to it, the way her mouth forgot to hide how it felt. He had loved a woman before, and grief had taught him not to pretend that a new fire made the ashes of the old less real. But here, beside a yellow mouth opening to the sky, he learned that the heart is not a single room. It's a house with doors a man can close against storm and still choose to open for light. "Let me show you something," he said softly. He took from his pocket the notebook he kept tucked against his chest and opened it to a page where a careful hand had sketched the ditch line and the angle of a culvert, and in the margin where numbers didn't fit a small sunflower. Badly drawn. Earnest. 2 petals thicker than the others, like a child's exaggeration of joy. "You draw like a man who measures," she teased. "I do everything like a man who measures," he said, mock wounded. She touched the paper without pressing the roughness of graphite under her fingertip, like a path laid for a foot that hadn't stepped yet. "Keep that," she said. "When winter comes, it will be a promise you don't have to hear to believe." Evening slid over them with braided colors, copper into violet, into the kind of blue that understands work. They stood only when the chill insisted and the flower folded its stamens to sleep. Naya straightened slowly, hand in the small of her back, as if lifting up took more than muscle. Ethan offered his arm halfway and then, remembering she disliked being treated breakable, offered only a glance that asked. She took it. Not because she had to, because she could. The next days stitched themselves with the new thread of bloom. A second flower opened, then a third, staggering themselves like a chorus learning harmony by ear. Naya watered at dawn and dusk, teaching the plants to want the day more than the bucket. Alma brought butter she'd traded for and insisted the first petal she saw would mean everyone owed her a story. Ortiz stuck a sliver of wood at the row's end and carved a crooked sun at the top with his knife. Pike put his hat over his heart once, quick and embarrassed when he thought no one watched. The crew framed the small house Markham had promised, a rectangle of ribs that caught the sky between them, a doorway where Naya stood for a long minute without crossing, because sometimes a threshold is a thing you need to greet like a person. "We'll put your window on the east," Ethan said. "Let the mornings in where they mean to go." She nodded. "And a shelf by the stove tall enough so small hands have to ask." "You planning for small hands?" he asked, lightly, then looked as if he wanted to tuck the question back into his mouth. She didn't flinch. "I am planning for the ones who come to learn," she said. "Women, girls, sometimes a boy who thinks he has to stand in a prayer until he turns to stone." He breathed out, grateful. She saw it, and said the next thing before he had to. "Your wife wore sunflowers," she said, looking at the field instead of his face. "In her hair." His voice gentled. "She did. 1,000 summers ago." Naya nodded. "Then she would like this," she said. "Not the forgetting, the blooming. He closed his eyes a moment as if someone had put a cool hand against a hot thought. She would. When a calf went lame at the far pasture, Ethan pulled off his boots and waded the ditch to fetch Pike and came back mud to the knees and unreasonably pleased at the work. Naya wiped his legs with a rag and scolded him for catching the chill like a woman who had scolded no one for years and found it sweet in the mouth. He took the cloth from her and finished the job with a look that said he heard the care and would not waste it. A fever ran through Alma's youngest one night, fierce and bright. Naya brewed willow and mint-ladled broth that had been simmering since yesterday, and sat with the child until the heat broke into shivers, and then sleep. When she returned to the shed before dawn, Ethan had left the lamp burning low, and a note on the table that said simply, "Here." She touched the word like a charm. The first sunflower opened fully on a morning so clear the sky seemed scrubbed. Its face turned not to the east as legend demanded, but a little south, stubborn as any living thing. Naya laughed again, quieter now, and eased her palm beneath its head to feel the weight. She had never planted anything that belonged to her. She had never watched a thing grow because she insisted it do so and then obeyed. She felt a sudden fierce urge to build a fence around the entire plain and label it mine, and knew at once that she would never need to. The work itself drew a circle no one else could see. Ethan came without her calling and stood with his shoulder almost touching hers. He didn't talk about the survey, or the culvert angle, or the argument he'd lost with Markham over the cost of nails. He simply looked at what she had made and let his face be changed by it. "Do you hear it?" she asked. "Hear what?" "The sound of staying," she said. "It's like when a wagon finally settles after a long day on bad road. Everything stops rattling, not quiet, just settled." He listened, actually listened, standing there with the plane opening like a page. "Yes," he said, and the word was a landing. That evening, she sifted flour with Alma's borrowed sieve and kneaded dough until it stopped arguing back. She dusted a pinch of ground sage over the top and laughed at herself for making bread like a woman who believed in tomorrow. Ethan shaved a sliver from a rough board and whistled off key and content as he sanded the window frame. Outside, the flowers turned their faces toward light until light left, and then kept facing anyway, as if stubbornness could be its own sun. In the dark, when their breathing found the same slow tide, Naya let herself picture a small structure near the river. Nothing fancy, 4 posts and a roof where she would teach women to render fat and make broth to bind a seam so clean it could hold a life to brew what soothes and what strengthens. She saw girls copying her hand as she stitched, laughter snagging harmlessly on the edges of work. She saw a boy named Eli scowling at a needle and then, despite himself, learning. "Ethan," she whispered into the room that held them like careful palms. Would you build me a shed by the bend when the ditch is done?" He didn't even pretend to think. "Yes," he said, and then after a breath that tasted like cedar shavings and sleep, "We'll put its door where the sun first finds it." She smiled into the dark. The seeds under their feet were no longer only seeds. They had roots now, thin, stubborn fingers working down into the soil, deciding to believe in a sky they hadn't yet seen. Summer pressed its warm palm against Providence Plain, flattening grass and drawing sweat from every back that bent to work. The ditch line stretched like a scar, newly healed water, flowing slow and obedient where Ethan and his crew had argued it into sense. Sunflowers rose taller than Naya's shoulders now, their stalks thick, their faces wide, golden, insistent. She walked the rows each morning barefoot, the dirt cool between her toes, her fingers brushing leaves that rasped like paper promises. The house frame stood solid by then, rafters crossing like joined hands, a stovepipe poking from the roof with the pride of a flag. Ethan hammered late into dusk, his shirt, damp hair plastered to his brow. Every nail struck with the precision of a man who had spent too long in tunnels and meant now to build something that stayed above ground. Pike and Ortiz helped arguing about angles, swearing at splinters, laughing harder than the joke deserved, just to hear the sound. Naya stitched curtains from flour sacks, painted the sills yellow with a leftover tin. She'd begged off the trading post and scrubbed the boards until her arms trembled, but the floor shone faintly in the lamplight. She hung the sunflower cloths at the east window, one scarred, one crooked. One bowled a trio that leaned toward each other like a family. Neighbors began to come. First Alma, of course, with her brood trailing behind children sticky with honey and curiosity. Then others, two women from the cookhouse, one with a swollen belly, the other with a scar across her lip that didn't slow her smile. They came with questions that had waited years to be asked. How do you make broth hold a man through winter? What stitch keeps a shirt from splitting at the shoulders? How do you ease a fever when the river is too cold and the fire too hot? Naya showed them hands steady, voice soft but certain. She taught them to simmer bones until the water grew thick with memory to knot thread so it would not betray them to crush willow bark into powder that soothed the worst nights. The women listened, laughed at their mistakes. She found herself laughing too, the sound startling her each time, like a bird flushed from grass. Ethan watched from the doorway, more often than not leaning his shoulder against the frame, arms crossed, a quiet pride in his eyes. He never interrupted, never claimed space that wasn't his. When asked, he fetched tools, repaired benches, or explained how to reinforce shelves so they could bear jars of honey and beans. His voice was different here, lighter, less sharpened by the need to fight. One evening after the women had gone and the children had scattered down the lane, Naya sat by the stove braiding her hair. Ethan set down his tools and sat across from her. "They call you the sunflower girl," he said, his mouth curving faintly. Her hand stilled mid-braid. "Do they?" "They do. And they're right." She looked at him uncertain until his gaze made the name feel like more than a nickname. It felt like a crown of petals no one could take. The next day, Eli came running with his slingshot slapping his side, breathless with news. "Your flowers, they're taller than me." He threw his arms wide to prove it. "And there's so many." She laughed, kneeling to his height. "That's the way of them. They like company." Eli's eyes shone. "Then I'll plant some too." And he did crooked little rows behind his family's shack seeds, tucked clumsily, but with devotion. Naya knelt beside him, guiding his small fingers. She realized she was teaching not just stitches and broth, but something larger. The audacity to believe tomorrow deserved roots. At night, when the children's voices faded and the plain lay quiet under its quilt of stars, Naya and Ethan sat by their stove. No papers signed, no rings exchanged, only breath shared in the hush. She rested her head against his shoulder, and he let his hand fall lightly over hers. No words, because words would have made it smaller than it was. But the plane was not finished testing them. Storms came hard in July's sky, split wide lightning laying its jagged fingers across the horizon, rain lashing the windows until the curtains wept. The ditch swelled water, frothing, threatening to climb its banks. Ethan pulled on his boots, Pike and Ortiz at his side, shovels in hand, mud swallowing their ankles. They reinforced Doug argued with the flood until it grudgingly turned back. Naya stood in the doorway, her shawl clutched, her voice swallowed by the wind. Every flash of lightning painted Ethan's figure stark against the night, bent relentless alive. When he finally returned, soaked to bone, face smeared with mud, she dragged him inside and pressed a blanket around his shoulders. His body shook with cold, but his eyes gleamed proud of winning an argument with water. "You'll make me gray," she muttered, scolding him as she rubbed his arms. He caught her hand in his. "Then we'll be gray together." The storm passed, the plane steaming in its aftermath. The sunflowers bowed heavy with water, then straightened, shaking droplets like laughter. Weeks stretched. The house filled with jars, beans, honey, herbs. The shed by the river took shape, a small school for the women who came with questions. Naya painted the door frame yellow. Ethan carved her name into the lintel above it. One evening, as the sun dipped low, they stood together at the edge of the field. Dozens of golden faces turned toward the dying light, stubborn, radiant. Naya slipped her hand into Ethan's. "Do you see them?" she whispered. "I do. They don't give up. Neither do you." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her smile hidden but real. For the first time in years, she believed she was not surviving anymore. She was living. And somewhere in the quiet between the rows of sunflowers and the slow song of the river, Ethan. Beckett realized he had not just been given a second chance at work or breath. He had been given a second chance at home. Autumn slipped over Providence Plain like a quilt stitched from copper and gold. The grass turned brittle, the air thinned, and the mornings carried frost that laced every fence post in silver. But the sunflowers refused to bow. Their broad faces stood tall, their stalks creaking when the wind bent them but never breaking. They became a landmark visible for miles, golden beacons rising out of the earth like defiance itself. Naya walked their rows daily, gathering seeds in a linen sack she had stitched from flower cloth. She worked with reverence fingertips, brushing each bloom before plucking its gift. For next year, she whispered to each one, for the ground that will need reminding. She taught the children who came to help how to press seeds between thumb and forefinger, how to dry them so they did not rot, how to save what mattered. Eli beamed as if trusted with the keys to a kingdom. The shed by the river had become more than a place for cooking lessons. It was a sanctuary. Women came with baskets of root vegetables, with shirts torn from labor, with quiet questions about bruises they didn't explain. Naya listened. She mended. She taught. She brewed teas for fevers and laid stitches that held. Sometimes she just sat with them until silence softened. Word spread the sunflower girl would not turn you away. Ethan watched her from the house, leaning on the doorframe after a day spent laying culverts and mending fences. His heart swelled at the sight of her seated cross-legged on the shed floor, a ring of women and children around her. She laughed more now, full-bodied laughter that startled birds from the grass. He had thought he'd never hear such a sound again. He realized he was building not just a house, not just a line of water, but a life that could carry both of them forward. But the past does not die cleanly. One afternoon, a rider arrived from the south. Dust clung to his coat, his horse's ribs heaved. He asked for Ethan Beckett by name. In his hand, he carried a folded message, the wax seal bearing the mark of the company. Ethan broke it open at the table, his brow furrowing as his eyes scanned the lines. His jaw tightened. Naya watched him, her heart beating harder with every second of his silence. "What is it?" she asked, finally. He set the letter down. "They're reopening Stratton Ridge." The words fell like a stone between them. After the gas? After men died. They claim new ventilation shafts, new safety measures. Hale's handwriting is all over it, his mouth twisted. He's asking me to return, says they want me to oversee, to sign off on the new blasts. Naya's hands curled in her lap. She felt the old fear return like a shadow across her chest, the smell of coal smoke, the hiss of gas, the earth groaning like a wounded beast. "And will you?" He looked at her, his eyes pale as frost. "No." The word was steel. "I won't put my name under graves, not theirs, not mine, not yours." Relief shuddered through her, but it carried anger too. Then why write at all? "Because men like Hale think names are coins," Ethan said. "And they think mine still spends." For a long time they sat in silence. Outside, the sunflowers rustled the sound like 1,000 voices agreeing with the wind. Days passed, but the letter lingered in their tent like smoke that wouldn't clear. Ethan burned it, finally feeding the fragments to the stove, but Naya could still see the black curl of the seal in her mind. She wondered how many men would go back into that ridge, how many would not return. Autumn deepened. They finished the roof-stacked firewood in neat cords-lined shelves with jars of beans and corn. Ethan carved her name and his above the door, the letters uneven but joined. It was the first time either of them had written something not to forget but to remember. One evening, as the light faded gold across the fields, Ethan led her to the ditch line. Water slid through calm, obedient, reflecting the sky in pieces. He set his hand over hers, guiding her fingers to the level, showing her how the bubble found its balance. She laughed softly at the precision, but her eyes glowed as the world made sense beneath her touch. "You build with numbers," she teased, "and you build with seeds," he said. "Together." "Together," he answered, and the word felt like a cornerstone. Winter hinted at the edges of the plain. Geese arrowed overhead, their cries sharp against the wide sky. The first frost turned the sunflower leaves black, their golden faces drooping but proud even in death. Naya collected every last seed she could, storing them in jars, each one a promise that this life would return. That night, she and Ethan sat by the stove. He wrote slowly in his notebook, his hand steadier than it had been in years. She sewed beside him, her thread pulling neat lines through cloth. Outside, coyotes sang the plain answering with its long, low breath. You never asked me to stay, she said suddenly, not looking up. Ethan's pencil paused. I never needed to. She smiled small and full. I know. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he pressed his lips to her hair. Outside, the first snow began to fall light tentative, like a curtain slowly drawing over a stage. But inside, the fire burned steady. The seeds slept safe, and two souls scarred by ash and hunger dared finally to believe they had found home. Snow stayed only a day that first week, a lace that melted from fence rails and slid from eaves in drips. The plane breathed out a white ghost at dawn and forgot it by noon. In that in-between, wagons arrived with bells that didn't ring, and with them came the past. The traders rolled in under pewter sky, a crooked line of mules. Ethan met them for nails, pitch, and wire. Naya watched from the doorway, wiping her hands on a flour sack, narrowing at the smell of coffee and old leather, the scent of leaving and not quite returning. They were a mixed lot. At the back walked two Comancheros, boots soft with Miles' beadwork, flashing like remembered lightning. Naya's breath snagged. Not at the beads. At the way the older Comanchero turned his head to hear the river, the listening that belonged to a people who read the world by ear and scent and shadow. The old life brushed her like a coat sleeve. Naya traded a jar of honey and a pot of bone broth for needles thread, a thimble that had known better songs. All of it felt like ordinary barter until the older Comanchero stopped as if a string had tightened between them. He studied her. Where did you come from? He asked in Spanish, that had learned its vowels on open ground. From the south, she said. From farther than that, he answered. He tapped his chest with two fingers, a gesture and a question. Comanche. She nodded. His gaze shifted to the tall, black-leafed stalks, their frost-bowed heads studded with seed. You planted a sky, he said. She tucked the words away as she tucked Needle's sharp end turned inward, safe for now. Do you need water always? He drank and set the dipper down. The younger Comanchero took in what mattered, ditch, Shedhouse the man standing politely far enough away to be summoned or refused. He saw the names carved over the door and made no face at it. The older one took something from his pouch and laid it in her palm, a disc of bone polished by years burned with a simple sun. For your teaching shed, he said. Sun finds itself. He paused. I heard near the Canadian, a caravan years ago. A girl lost, a woman traded. They say a child hid beneath skins. They say the woman had a scar by her thumb like a half moon. His eyes searched her hands. Your mother? Naya's throat went tight. She turned her right hand palm up. Along the base of her thumb, the half-moon scar gleamed pale. He nodded once. I thought so. She was sold, Naya said. I never found where. Grief and anger braided in his gaze. No one tells the whole road, but he looked toward the river. A woman answered to Yisa near the Canadian, tending a trader's fire, feeding the hungry from what little she kept. She wore a strip at her waist, yellow with black seeds. He touched the disc. Like this. Sunflowers in winter. Her mother's hands. The smell of stew. Hope rose anyway, a thin, bright thread. Is she? He lifted a palm. I say only what I heard. Ears lie less than tongues. I am not a prophet. She closed her fingers around the disc as if it might burn a path through time. Thank you, she said. When the traders moved on, dust settled like a thought deciding where to land. Ethan came, not touching leaving room. What did he say, he asked. She told him in pieces, the half-moon, the Canadian, the scrap of yellow cloth. She didn't tell him about the part of her that had already run miles to follow a rumor because he heard it anyway. If you want to go, he said, I'll hitch the wagon. We'll follow any whisper you choose. She looked at him, then really looked. A man who had followed her into a shaft and out of it when staying would have killed him. A man who had given her paper and then fed paper to the stove. And if the whisper is wind, she asked, and leaves us somewhere empty. Then we camp, he said, and build a fire from what will burn that won't hurt us to lose. Her laugh was a wet sound. You make it easy. It isn't, he said, but it's ours. That night the bone disc hung from a nail in the shed, catching lamplight and throwing it back in a little halo. Women gathered with baskets, and Naya's hands did what they knew, measured, knotted, steeped, while her mind walked old trails, listening for a voice that had taught her songs under the wind. She heard only her own breath. Word spread as hope does when it offers a map to a missing heart. A rancher's wife arrived with questions she pretended were about stitches and were not. Alma squeezed Naya's shoulder, permission to cry, and a command not to both together. Eli promised to water the flowers every day if she went, then worried winter made the promise foolish. Naya lay awake. Ethan's breath beside her rose and fell like a tide that knew its shore. She watched the seam of the sunflower cloth and thought of the seam in her stitched by hunger and time, and a stranger's pen, and later by a man clumsy at fabric. She had been mended. She feared to pull at that seam. Before dawn, she rose, wrapped a shawl, and stepped into the yard. Frost warned the grass and let it go. The river talked low. In the east, a pale slice promised day. She looked at the field. Blackened the tall heads knew their work, seeds tucked away. Stems creaked but stood. She spoke aloud because sometimes the air needs to hear you decide. "I won't chase ghosts," she said, "but I won't close the door if a living hand knocks." Ethan came to the doorway, boots unlaced. He waited. She nodded. "We stay. If word comes again more than wind, we go." He nodded. "We'll be ready." She found a counterweight to hope and work. She taught all morning, her voice sure where her heart wavered. She sent Eli with a loaf and an instruction, bring back a story about how frost tastes. She scolded Pike for carrying too much on a bad shoulder. She lined 3 jars of seed and labeled each spring. Summer. After. All day the bone disc clicked against the door whenever the draft came curious. A sound like a clock that refused to count down to anything but patience. At dusk, she walked the rows remembering where roots had fought stones. A hawk sketched figure 8s overhead. She loosened one sunflower head and shook it into her palm. A scatter of seeds, a promise that did not depend on ledgers or on rumors walking north out of old harm. Ethan waited with 2 mugs of something hot and mean with cinnamon. To your mother, he said simple. Wherever she stands tonight, Naya lifted hers. She pictured a woman by a different river under a different sky with the same scar and the same stubborn jaw. To her, she said, and to the ones who fed us when the world forgot. They drank. The sky turned iron, then velvet. Coyotes tuned their instruments. The stove ticked itself into contentment. In bed under a quilt that smelled of sage and smoke, Naya lay awake, but not like before. Hope stayed bright and no longer strangled. It ran beside another thread, darker, stronger, a decision. Not to be only what had been taken, not to spend her life writing letters to a past that would not answer. She reached into the dark and found Ethan's hand. He stirred and his fingers closed around hers with the same reflex a sunflower has for light. "I'm here," he murmured. "I know," she said. And because the night was listening, because the river was too, she added one more vow tied not to a rumor or a wound, but to the ground beneath her. "I will keep planting," she whispered. "So if she finds me, there is something to walk toward." The plain breathed. The frost held. The bone sun at the shed door turned once on its thong and stilled as if agreeing in a language older than both of them. Winter arrived without asking permission. The wind came first, sliding off the mountains sharp enough to cut through wool. Then the snow followed, heavy, steady, muffling every sound except the creak of ice beneath boots. Providence Plain vanished beneath white, the ditches asleep under their frozen quilt, the fields silent where sunflowers once sang. Naya rose before dawn, as always, feeding the stove until its iron glowed like an ember in the dark. She baked bread in the heavy pot, its crust crackling against the cold, and stirred a pot of beans that steamed the windows over with fog. Outside the shed by the river wore a snowcap, its door iced shut, but women still came, shawls drawn, high cheeks red from wind. They gathered inside by the fire, stamping snow from their boots. Grateful for warmth, for Naya's voice, for lessons that tethered them to life when the world outside threatened to swallow it. She showed them how to render fat into candles, how to sew double seams into quilts, how to make broth thick enough to carry a man through weeks when meat was scarce. And when a neighbor's baby burned with fever, Naya sat all night by the cradle spooning willow tea into a mouth that finally remembered to swallow. She did not sleep, but when the fever broke at dawn, the mother wept into her hands, and Naya held her as if she had been holding women her whole life. Ethan worked in the cold breath white hands, stiff in gloves, as he repaired fences snapped by ice and chopped wood into cords stacked neat against the shed. He was not the same man who had once hidden in maps and whiskey. Now he laughed with Ortiz and Pike. Even when their fingers shook, now he taught boys to mend harness straps instead of letting them crack. Now he walked home each night with a tiredness that came from work worth doing. But winter is a teacher with no patience. One storm came hard in late January, snow thick as wool sky, black at noon wind howling like an animal. The shed shook under its weight, the stove hissing as if to argue with the cold. Ethan went out twice to clear drifts from the roof before it buckled. The third time Naya followed him, rope tied between them, her hair stiff with ice before she'd taken 10 steps. "Go back inside," he shouted over the wind. "You'll freeze alone," she shot back, her voice raw with frost. Together they shoveled until their arms were lead. Snow climbed up their boots, packed their sleeves, fought to bury them, but they dug and dug until the roof held and the door cleared. When they stumbled back inside, breathless, their faces burned red with cold. Their laughter startled even them, laughter at being alive, at beating the storm back, even for an hour. Later by the fire, Naya's hands shook as she held her cup. Ethan covered them with his own rough and scarred, and for a long moment neither spoke. Outside the storm raged on, but inside the silence was the kind that belonged to two people who had survived together. When the snow finally stopped, the plain lay buried white to the horizon. Yet from the drift near the shed, a single stalk poked through one sunflower, black and bent still upright. Naya found it while carrying ash to scatter. She stopped, knelt, brushed frost from its face. It was ugly, stubborn, broken. She loved it instantly. She carried the head inside, laid it on the table. Ethan looked at it and smiled faintly. Even dead, it remembers the sun. Naya cupped it in her hands, seeds rattling within small promises waiting for spring. "Then we remember with it," she said. The weeks dragged long, dark hours of wind and hunger, but they held. The seeds sat in jars like coins against famine. The stove ate wood but gave back warmth. And in the shed, women kept coming, refusing to be buried. By February, stories spread from the south of Stratton Ridge, reopened, of men coughing black into their hands, of another collapse hushed up by clerks with fresh paper. Ethan's jaw tightened when he heard. Naya's hands curled around the boned son hanging on the door, praying silently for the mother she had never stopped searching for. But Providence was theirs now. And no clerk's letter, no storm, no hunger would change the truth planted in the frozen soil that they had chosen to stay to build, to make something that could outlast even winter. One night, as coyotes sang far across the white plain, Ethan reached for Naya's hand in the dark. She closed her fingers around his steady, certain. And though the cold outside pressed hard against the walls inside, they felt the first stirrings of spring. Because hope had already taken root waiting under snow. Spring came slow, as if suspicious it would be welcomed. The snow shrank in fits, retreating into ditches and shadowed gullies, leaving behind earth heavy with water and hope. Providence Plain woke in ragged patches, mud first, then shy grass, then birds stitching songs through the dawn. Naya stepped outside barefoot, her toes sinking into thaw. She carried a sack of saved seeds, each one a promise she had guarded through winter. At the field's edge, she knelt, pressing the first seed into softened earth. Her breath left her lips like a prayer. "Bloom," she whispered. This time, stronger. Ethan joined her, setting down his tools to help draw furrows. His hands, built for compasses and iron, now worked the soil without hesitation. Together they planted row after row until the sack was empty, their palms dark with earth, their shoulders burning in the pale sun. They straightened at last, dirt streaking their cheeks, and for the first time in months they both laughed without remembering pain. The ditch carried water again, glinting in the light. Pike and Ortiz helped haul stones to shore it, singing off-key, their voices lifting like banners in the breeze. Eli skipped along the bank, dropping 2 seeds at once into the mud, despite Naya's teasing. "Double is better," he insisted, his grin missing teeth, but not conviction. By May, green blades split the soil, stretching greedily toward sky. Naya walked the rows daily, brushing her fingertips over leaves, humming low tunes that were half lullaby, half command. The women came again, their baskets lighter, but their spirits fuller, drawn by the shed smoke and the sunflower girl, who always had answers, or at least a place to rest their burdens. One afternoon, a rider appeared from the south. Dust clung to his coat, his horse thin. He carried no ledger, no clerk's arrogance, only a letter folded into his breast. He asked for Naya. Her hand shook as she unfolded the paper. The words were scrawled uneven but clear. A woman named Yisa lives still near the Canadian. Scar at the thumb. She asks for a daughter she lost. The world tilted. For a moment, Naya could not breathe. Her mother alive. Not rumor, not ghost. A truth written in ink that smelled of sweat and road. Tears burned her eyes before she could stop them. Ethan steadied her, one hand on her shoulder, his face unreadable, but his eyes fierce. "Then we'll go," he said. Naya shook her head, trembling. "The seeds, I just planted them. The women, they depend on me. If I leave now all this work—" "You don't have to choose," Ethan said. "We can tend both. We'll leave Ortiz and Pike to water. Alma will mind the shed. Eli will stand guard like a wolf, and we will go find her." Naya pressed the letter to her chest. "What if it's too late, then we'll bring back what's left. Even ashes can be honored." His voice softened. "But what if it isn't too late?" The decision cut like a blade and healed like a stitch all at once. She nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. "We'll go." They prepared quickly, Ethan sharpening tools, Naya packing dried beans and broth. Alma pressing a quilt into her arms. Eli clung to her waist, fierce as any cub. "Bring her back," he whispered. "She has to see the sunflowers." The next dawn they set out. The plain unrolled before them, green stitched with yellow, the river singing behind. The wagon wheels creaked, the horse tossed its head, and every turn of the road carried them closer to a face Naya had only seen in memory. Days stretched long nights, cold under stars. Ethan drove silent but steady, his hand brushing hers when the road jarred. Naya read the letter again and again, as though the ink might vanish if she let it rest. She prayed in whispers to wind to sun, to the bone disc swinging from the shed door back home. At last they reached the Canadian. Smoke rose from a small settlement cabins clustered along the river's bend. Children played in dust, women hung laundry in the wind. And there by a fire, her hair streaked silver, her back strong, her thumb scarred with a pale half-moon, stood Yisa. Naya's knees buckled. The world blurred. She stumbled forward, her voice breaking free in a cry that tore years apart. "Mother." The woman turned. Her eyes widened, filled, overflowed. She dropped the pot she held, the broth spilling into earth forgotten. She ran arms outstretched, tears shining like the river. When they collided, time shattered. 20 years of silence, hunger, and longing broke in a single embrace. Yisa sobbed against Naya's hair, whispering her name over and over, as if saying it could bind the years they had lost. Ethan stood back, his chest tight, his vision blurring. He had seen men saved from shafts lives, dragged out of gas, but never had he seen two souls stitched back together with such ferocity. He bowed his head, knowing this moment belonged only to them. For hours they sat by the fire, hands clasped, words tumbling like water over stones. Yisa spoke of years stolen, of caravans and trades, of surviving by sheer defiance. Naya spoke of mines, of escape, of sunflowers planted in soil that had tried to refuse her. They wept. They laughed. They ate from the same bowl as if afraid to let go again. When night fell, Naya leaned against her mother's shoulder, her eyes still damp but her voice steady. "I planted them, Mama. A whole field. They follow the sun even when the sky forgets it." Yisa kissed her brow. "Then so do you." Ethan watched them, silent, grateful. For once, the world had given back what it had taken. And as the fire crackled and the stars burned, he knew some seeds, no matter how long buried, would always find a way to bloom. They stayed beside the Canadian long enough for tears to turn into sentences. In the mornings, Naya and Yisa sat at the river's bend, with their skirts pulled up and their feet in the cold water, trading memories like small rescued coins, who used to sing the coyote song Wrong on Purpose, which winter they survived on parched corn, and laughter the way a mother's hand learns the shape of her child's head, even after 20 years of reaching into empty air. Ethan let the days lengthen without hurry. He mended a crooked fence for a neighbor, fixed a pump that stuttered, sharpened a boy's dull knife, and showed him how to hold a stone against steel until both learned patience. One evening, as the sky burned down to ash blue, Isa looked across the fire and studied the man her daughter had chosen, with the quiet appraisal of a woman who had bartered for survival. "You listen," she said to Ethan, and it wasn't a question. "That matters more than promises." "I learned from someone who didn't have the luxury of being heard," he answered. Isa nodded, once satisfied and bruised all at once. To Naya she said, "I have a corner here. Women bring trouble and I make it smaller, but the road between corners is short if you want it to be. Take me north. Let me see the field you planted in the world's scar." They left at dawn 2 days later, a small procession that felt bigger than it looked. Isa, on a borrowed mule with a bundle no heavier than the life she carried. Naya in the wagon with her face turned toward a horizon she'd stitched herself. Ethan on the seat with the reins loose, his eyes measuring distance and blessing it. The road unrolled in a ribbon of dust. When it rutted, Ethan slowed. When it smoothed, Naya's hand found his. Twice they stopped to brew tea in a tin cup and let the steam teach their faces softness again. Providence greeted them the way the honest earth does, without trumpets with work waiting. Alma saw them first and hollered so loudly the geese lifted off the river like a straightened hem. Eli came pounding down the lane, waving both arms and overshooting the wagon so far he had to run a circle to return. He stopped dead round-eyed at Isa, as if a story had stepped out of a book and asked for bread. Ortiz and Pike held off, helping with the bundles just long enough to pretend they hadn't cried. The house had learned to look like it intended to stand a while. The yellow-painted sills brightened the afternoon. The ditch sang. The shed door wore its little bone sun. Naya led Yisa across the threshold. There are doorways meant to be crossed quietly. This was not one of them. They paused in it the way you pause at a grave or a birth. Then they entered. Yisa stood before the east window, her palm against the glass eyes on the sunflower cloths. She reached out and touched the seam down the middle of the oldest one, the visible mending the scar that did not pretend to be anything else. She did not speak for a long time. When she turned, her cheeks were wet, and she was smiling like a woman who had finally decided she could set something down. "You kept the sun when you could not find it," she said. "You made it stay." Naya laughed and wept in the same breath. She took the strip of yellow cloth her mother had always worn tied at the waist, the one burned with tiny black seeds, and knotted it around the shed's doorpost where the bone disc hung. The wind lifted the strip and let it fall. It looked like a small flag, remembering what it's for. "Now both our corners share a doorway," Yisa said. Work folded Yisa into the plane as if it had been missing her shape. In the shed, she showed the women how to use a stone to soften old maize, how to grind with your whole body so the meal carried strength from earth to bone. Her voice slipped easily between languages and never lost its music. She sang while her hands moved and the girls echoed her on a second try. When a young wife arrived with silence, the color of a bruise, Yisa put warm broth in her and asked no questions until the broth had built a floor under the words. Then she listened. When the listening was done, she taught a stitch that would not break and called it by the girl's name. Ethan repaired the hinge on the shed door so it no longer announced every visitor like a judge. He built a cupboard for jars and carved sunflowers along its face, rough and brave, each petal a little different the way every day is. He and Pike set corner posts for a fence line that would keep wandering cattle from thinking the ditch was a suggestion. Ortiz taught Eli a knot that holds without fighting back when it's time to go free. The field rose. What had been small green tongues licking at air now became stalk, and then bud. And then one morning so clear, Naya thought the sky had bathed an explosion of yellow that sprinted to the horizon. Their land turned into a sea, and the flowers its bright, restless waves. People came from the far edge of the plain just to stand at the gate and breathe easier without knowing why. Naya walked to the rows barefoot, the dirt warm, brushing her fingers along the rough leaves, counting under her breath like a woman taking attendance in a school taught by light. That afternoon, when the sun leaned west and the field nodded like 1,000 throats swallowing the same answer, Ethan sat by the east window in the oak chair Naya had bargained for at the trading post. The sunflower curtain lifted and fell, the house's quiet lungs. His journal lay open on his lap, its pages curled with use and steam and breath. He held the pencil the way you hold a thing you intend to be honest with. Isa's laugh drifted from the shed. Alma answered with mock scandal. Eli whooped at a story that involved a heroic cat. The sound braided through the room and made the floor stronger. He wrote, slowly, carefully. The way a man writes when he has learned that words can turn into tents, and tents can save a life for a night or for the kind of forever people make by staying. They said you were a girl to be sold, but you were the fire that made ashes bloom again. You said you would be anything I needed. All I ever needed was someone who stayed. He stopped, looked out the window. The field bobbed as if nodding yes. Naya came in with a bowl of roasted squash and sage steam carrying sweetness into every corner. She set it by his journal and saw ink drying like a small new river. She did not read. She did not have to. She leaned against the window frame, the yellow strip outside flicking like a heartbeat at the edge of her vision. You're writing again, she said. You told me not to let my hands forget. Are they remembering? They are, he said, but with different maps. She knelt on the rug beside his chair and rested her head against his knee. Outside, the river stuck to its agreement and kept going. The house settled wood sighing in ways only people who had slept there long enough could hear. I never thought I'd have a place that waited for me, she said softly. A stove, a name on the door, a mother in the yard, a man who smells like cedar and sun. He smoothed her hair back, his thumb catching at a curl. Now you do. And if the road knocks again, she asked, not doubt, only inventory. Then we'll set a plate, he said. Make a bed, pack a bag. Roads aren't enemies here, they're just other ways for the sky to reach us. They ate, passing the spoon back and forth, laughing when the sage burned his tongue. Isa came in and scolded them for not saving her a larger share, then kissed both their foreheads in the same motion. Later, the three of them stood in the doorway as dusk laid its gold over every face in the field. The flowers kept turning even after the sun left, as if they had learned stubbornness from the people who had dared to plant them. Night settled like a kindness earned. Coyotes discussed their business far off. The ditch murmured. The bone sun on the shed door clicked once and grew still. In the small house, Naya and Ethan lay by the window with the curtain lifted so starlight could find their hands. He could feel the seam of her old rope burn under his fingertip, a faint ring, a saved life. She could feel the scrawl of his name cut into the doorframe across the room, and hers above it, uneven letters that had chosen to live on the same wood. Home, she said into the dark. Home, he answered. In the morning, he would be out early laying a plank on the little bridge over the ditch so children didn't wet their boots. She would be at the shed teaching a girl to thread a needle without licking it. Isa would be at the stove singing the coyote song on purpose the wrong way to make Eli laugh. Alma would arrive with a pot to borrow and a story to leave. Ortiz would bring a hinge. Pike would curse a post-hole digger and bless it in the same breath. The flowers would turn their faces to the sun they had decided to keep, even when Cloud argued for forgetting. But now there was only breath. The plane held them. The roof held. The past did not vanish, but it learned its place beneath and made into something that feeds. And when sleep finally took them, Ethan's journal lay open by the window, the last sentence not needing ink to be true. Wherever there is you and flowers and firewood stacked by the door, that is where I bloom. Your thoughts will help us create meaningful stories. And if you want to hear more powerful healing stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the bell icon so you don't miss any new episodes. And most importantly, share this video with people who need a little hope today. Thank you so much for your time. We hear you, we listen to you, and we are honored to tell these stories for you.